Okay, well, good morning. Welcome to our part 2 of Electricity and the Grid Infrastructure Work Group meeting. My name is Annalisa Bevan. I'm the Zero Emission Infrastructure Specialist for CARB. We've been hosting these meetings with the intent of supporting the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation and really providing a platform for a focused conversation about specific infrastructure topics, given that infrastructure is such a crucial part of implementation of any zero emission vehicle or equipment rollout. And what we're going to do today is pick up where we left off from our first meeting on infrastructure and grid issues. I'll remind folks that we were having a lively conversation in our first meeting and couldn't get through the entire agenda. So I'll summarize very briefly some of the big topics that came up in that first meeting and go over what we plan to have conversation about today. In particular, we heard a great deal of emphasis on the need for communication between utilities and fleets, especially around timing and infrastructure needs, total power needs, and interconnect times. There was also a significant conversation about the role that backup power and on-site generation could play, and a request to CARB to incorporate consideration of backup power and on-site generation in our assumptions about how fleets will comply with the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation. And overall, a lively discussion about the concerns and need for resiliency and reliability of the grid, and especially how that could impact fleets which are providing essential services. So those were some of the themes from our first meeting. Today, we're going to talk more about the process of rolling out electric infrastructure, and also about rate structures and load management. And so I would like to introduce the CARB team. Leslie Goodbody, who you've probably all heard from because she's been organizing these meetings, is with our Mobile Source Control Division. Thank you, Leslie, for putting these on. Catherine Garrison, who's also with my team, has been helping out with logistics of this meeting and organization. Craig During, manager overseeing the Advanced Clean Fleets, and Paul Arneja, also lead on Advanced Clean Fleets. Brandon Rose, also with MSCD, is on, and we have, let's see, we had some late folks joining the crew. Wenty Yin, who has been our tech behind the scenes, getting this meeting going. Really appreciate that. Did I skip anybody on the CARB team?
Paul, if he's here.
Yeah, I got Paul.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. Oh, it looks like we also have Chris Franceschi, who's also part of the MSCD team. Okay, let's start with some quick updates from our state agency partners who are joining us in this series of meetings. We're really appreciative of their participation in this. We feel that having our agency partners present with these discussions makes this conversation so much more meaningful, because hearing from stakeholders about their concerns that other agencies will have a key role in addressing is not as valuable as having those agencies present with us to hear about them, to answer questions, and be part of this conversation. So my deep thanks to all of our agency partners for being here. Let's start with the Energy Commission. Kyle Pratt has offered to lead for CEC.
Hello all, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Good morning. My name is Kyle Pratt, and I supervise the Vehicle Grid Integration Unit in the California Energy Commission's Fuels and Transportation Division. Normally, Elizabeth John, a manager in my division, takes on this role for CEC at these workshops. So she extends her apologies she can't join us today. My goal for this comment, I'll try to take around 3 minutes, is to summarize some of what we learned at the January 12th working group meeting, specifically some details on modeling, operating, and investing in the electric grid, and opportunities for charging medium and heavy duty vehicles. For example, for operating the grid, we heard from the California Independent System Operator last time about how, as an independent system operator, they do not own any of the generation fleet or high voltage transmission lines that they operate. So, for example, in the event of a public safety power shutoff is considered, that is not a capacity issue, but a safety call because of the weather conditions, and the CAISO defers to the owners of those assets, the utilities, for those calls. For investments, we know that utilities operate under different governance structures. The investor-owned utilities under the Public Utilities Commission, and municipal utilities have their own government structures and investment processes. But important in those considerations is the CEC's work tracking electric vehicle adoption, incorporating that along with other electricity load data into integrated energy system modeling. And that's something the Energy Assessments Division at CEC performs. And there's also a public data portal for ZEV statistics and such that CEC hosts. One result of this is a statewide demand forecast for electricity. All electricity, but layers for EVs, behind the meter solar and such. This is a very fine-grained forecast with hourly data for 10 years and a 10-year planning horizon. So a huge amount of data in a geographic footprints are segmented as well by utility, sometimes subdivided further, and CEC staff works with CAISO to adapt that forecast to individual nodes in CAISO's system. Now, the California Energy Demand Forecast is a foundational component of the state's energy planning. It's one of several forecasting products that are used in different energy planning proceedings, and it's relied on, but it's different from scenario work. The forecast is to evaluate existing conditions for the purpose of planning and procurement, or to consider forecast results as a reference point. But scenario work, on the other hand, is a different strategic planning exercise which begins with a targeted goal, such as a quantity of vehicles to meet in a future year, and then work backward from that. So the Energy Commission's Assembly Bill 2127 Charging Infrastructure Assessment Report, you may have heard about last time, that Elizabeth talked about, is one example of such scenario work. And the time that it could take to make upgrades to get power to the charging sites, so we're talking about boots on the ground instead of just the modeling analysis, that timing in those processes deeply involve the utilities, and the timeframes for those is an issue we're focusing in this work group and other forums. So our agencies continue to work closely together to both address the barriers to and help open the benefits of transportation electrification. But this process now is a critical part of engaging stakeholders early. And I hope we get to talk about some of the resilience items that were talked about in last meeting too, and compare it to the California policies as stated in an executive order from September 2020, for example, that talks about electrification of transportation segments where feasible. And we've seen some cases where resilience, such as in the setting of a water district, is a very important feature. So that in that circumstance, electrification is more challenging, and we need to understand these situations. So I'm excited for this conversation, and like everyone, I look forward to hearing from you today. Now I'll introduce Micah Wofford, an analyst from the Energy Commission's Fuels and Transportation Division, who presented on January 12th. Today he'll share updates on modeling medium and heavy duty charging and coordination across agencies recently, as we investigate topics from truck parking to mapping electric grid information. So please take it away, Micah.
Hey there, can you guys hear me? Awesome. So yeah, Micah Wofford, Energy Commission Specialist 1 in the Fuels and Transportation Division's Vehicle Grid Integration Unit with Kyle. So just going to give some quick updates on both the heavy load model and the edge tool as well. So for heavy load, the model has started using data from a recent drayage study that was conducted by CARB in order to better inform the model's drayage duty cycles and driving behaviors in order to develop more robust values for energy demand, and produce more accurate charging profiles. We are also working with CARB to develop a plan to use data from other sources, such as the large entity reporting effort and the truckers data set, which will likely include ongoing updates that will also be reflected in the heavy load model as well. We are also exploring some site-specific charging profiles using data from the Caltrans California statewide truck parking study. We are trying to tie specific load profiles to individual sites in order to increase the geospatial resolution of infrastructure projections, and also to get a better idea of available capacity at a more granular level. These modeling updates have been the result of a lot of great interagency collaboration. And additionally, the last ACF grid meeting that happened on January 12th also inspired some great external stakeholder coordination as well. Since then, we have been contacted by Amazon to discuss their plans for fleet electrification and data needs in terms of determining capacity and fleet conversion feasibility. So we plan to keep in contact with them regarding these critical issues, and also welcome others to reach out as well with the same or similar issues or questions. Great stakeholder collaboration is important for these models to be as accurate as possible. So also in terms of developing the EDGE tool, EDGE development is closely tied to heavy load activities, especially regarding determining the site-specific hosting capacity that I mentioned before. We understand that the need for a major update to the ICA data, the integration capacity analysis data, has been identified as part of the CPUC's high DER grid planning proceeding. The ICA data is what goes into EDGE primarily to inform the grid capacity information. So updates to that data will be proposed later this year, and a decision is expected in early 2023. And then after that is when the improvements will be made. So since this data is used within EDGE, any updates and improvements will also be reflected therein. So yeah, again, happy to be here during this conversation, and happy to take any further questions at a later time. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kyle and Micah. Next, we're going to hear from Michael Truax at the CPUC. Thanks, Michael.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Truax, a senior analyst on the CPUC's Transportation Electrification section. For anyone who's not familiar with the CPUC's role in the state, we are the regulators of California's 6 large electric investor-owned utilities, and for I'm assuming most people on this call, the 3 large utilities being PG&E, SCE, and SDG&E. This role has us playing a critical effort in supporting the state's transition to ZEVs as we provide guidance to and oversee the efforts made by the utilities to ensure that EVs can charge while supporting the grid. At a high level, the CPUC has 4 main roles in overseeing the utilities. These being the overseeing of the utility design of rates for fueling the EVs, overseeing the utility's deployment of utility side and customer side charging infrastructure, the development and overseeing of vehicle grid integration or VGI policies, and the overseeing of the utility's planning to integrate EVs within the electric grid. And finally, fourth, the implementation of the utility's current and future TE efforts and ensuring alignment with the utility's programs to support the state's EV goals. Succeeding in all of these roles requires the CPUC to work closely with our sister agencies, including CARB, CEC, and others that are participating on this call, to ensure that the electric grid can support expected EV charge load. We heard a lot of comments on grid readiness to support the expected EV charge load during the meeting that we had on January 12th. As CEC, Kyle, and Micah just mentioned, the CPUC and CEC are in frequent discussion to ensure that we are preparing the grid for the expected EV adoption. The CEC will be provides the CPUC's Integrated Resource Planning section, or IRP, which is the section that at the CPUC that leads efforts to ensure the utilities and other load-serving entities are building enough infrastructure to meet the system needs, local needs, and the flexible needs of the grid over a 10-year period, with forecasts to show different EV demand scenarios, which the IRP team will use to determine what investments to the grid are necessary to support EV regulations. In addition to this, the CPUC has the distributed resource planning proceeding, which is similar to the IRP, but it ensures the utilities have plans to identify the optimal locations of the deployment of distributed energy resources, which includes renewable resources, energy efficiency, energy storage, demand response technologies, and electric vehicles. These two efforts together, the IRP and DRP, are essential to ensuring the CPUC can continue to meet its mission to ensure safe, reliable, and affordable energy for all California ratepayers. Further, the CPUC has taken a number of steps to accelerate the utility's deployment of infrastructure to support EV charging. In October 2021, the CPUC approved 2 resolutions that authorize the utilities to offer non-residential customers looking to install separate metering EV charging services through an EV infrastructure rule. This rule will allow the utilities to install all utility-side infrastructure necessary to support EV charging without first receiving pre-approval from the CPUC. Second, the assigned commissioner that we work for, Commissioner Rechtschaffen, recently issued a ruling that includes a staff proposal that, if adopted by the commission, would establish a single statewide customer side of the meter rebate program that would prioritize rebates going to MDHD customers. Third, the CPUC and utilities will be hosting a workshop on March 28th to discuss the barriers to timely service energization, which is the time it takes between requesting the installation of EV chargers and when it is ready to actually be used to charge a vehicle. The utilities will use this workshop to inform the development of an average timeline for energizing an EV charger. Fourth, the CPUC is currently considering PG&E's application to extend their EV charge network program. This program, if approved, will see PG&E spending roughly $275 million to install 16,000 ports, 1,100 of which will be DCFC. Finally, the CPUC is currently overseeing the implementation of roughly $1.7 billion in funding for EV charging infrastructure. All these efforts will see the CPUC continue to support the state's EV goals and ensure safe and reliable electricity needed to meet our EV regulations. Beyond this, the CPUC is currently continuing to make efforts to ensure all electrification and DER efforts are viewed not just through the lens of a specific sector, but how they can all complement each other to be used to further our broader climate and energy goals. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, and I'll hand it back to Annalisa.
Thank you. Starting to have bandwidth issues, so I went off video. Next, I would like to ask Delphine from Cal ISO to give us an update.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate it, and glad to be on this panel again with everyone. So I think Kyle and Micah and Michael did a fantastic job of explaining the landscape. So I'll just add a little bit more color to it. So as Kyle and everyone mentioned, there is a demand forecast that is derivative of the California Energy Commission's work, and embedded in that is a lot of important legislation and growth for the electric vehicle fleet, both passenger as well as medium and heavy duty. So the point of the coordination is that the CAISO, when we do our grid level planning, is we are taking that forecast derived from the state agency and putting that all into all of our planning processes. But I also want to add that it's not just coordination between the Cal ISO and the California Energy Commission, but we also have CPUC as well as Air Resources Board. And that's a really important connection. Obviously, the CARB is doing a tremendous amount of work, in addition to hosting this workshop, of trying to understand where the fleet is going broadly for transportation electrification. But as Michael and Micah mentioned, the connection with the Public Utilities Commission is both for the distribution side utilities. And so I think what we heard from the last group here is that there is a lot of kind of a chicken and egg struggle between wanting to expand on the distribution side, but also for the distribution utilities not really knowing if that expansion, if they do expand the system, if the fleets and the large electrification will come. So I think the Public Utilities Commission is doing a lot of work. Air Resources Board is doing a lot of work to kind of break that chicken and egg logjam. But I do want to recognize that we also know that it's there. And that's why the planning space is also very important, because there's kind of two parts to it. And this was also mentioned by the prior speakers, which is the first part is the forecast. The forecast really reflects given what we know today, what does that look like going forward 10 years on? So given the adoption of electric vehicles and transportation electrification, which includes ports and other usages, and even broader into fuel substitution, given what we see today, what does that look like tomorrow? So that's one snapshot, and that goes into sort of what we think of as like sort of our basic planning processes. And that's coordinated through the distribution utilities for their systems, as well as for the CAISO for the wholesale system. So that kind of flows throughout. And as Michael mentioned, that also integrates with the integrated resource plan. That also flows through potentially a lot of the discussions through other processes, looking at capacity like the resource adequacy program. However, there is also an effort to look at scenarios. So what if we get much more electrification than we're planning for? For example, a lot of pickup on transportation electrification, not just the passenger, but big loads under heavy and medium duty, big port electrification. What does that look like? So that's also another really important body of work, and that also includes PUC, CARB, CEC, and CAISO, so that when we're looking at that, we also have this kind of alternative view of what that higher electrification looks like. And the point of that is to look at what the infrastructure build out may look like under those scenarios. Now, it's a little bit tricky because it doesn't necessarily mean, okay, here's the high electrification scenario, let's all build that. But there is a point in looking at these bookends, sort of what we have in the forecast going forward and what that higher bookend is, and to try to look at what that higher bookend is and identify, are there potential projects that would be least regret? So for example, given sort of normal load growth, you would have needed to upgrade these areas anyway, but under a high electrification, you will need those as well. So are there sort of least regrets projects and expansions that we can think of if we're looking at both the kind of forecast, I'll say the base case forecast, as well as these high growth scenarios? And also location is very important. As other commenters have mentioned, there's the granularity of the forecast at 8760, but also when we are working with the CAISO, we're breaking it down into our system so we understand the locational growth. So not only do we have the hourly growth, we have the locational aspects of it. And that's very important if we're talking about large load centers like ports that are electrifying, because that growth and that load is going to be concentrated in certain areas. And so especially in areas where we do have big load populations, load pockets, we want to be very mindful of what that electrification looks like, because we want to make sure that is reinforced and not just kind of peanut butter throughout the entire footprint. So I just wanted to kind of pull out some of those discussions, because I think the top line is, yes, there's a lot of coordination, but I think in the details are very important. Also, as Micah mentioned, there is also the high DER proceeding at the CPUC, and that is also very involved with the distribution utilities and looking at, that kind of, higher electrification future. Transportation electrification is a very big part of that. And so we're all working in that form as well to try to understand, what does that look like, the build out looks like, and obviously input from folks on this call and other, end users that are actually doing that investment. Hearing from you all is also very important, because even in the sort of the base case forecasting, there is that consultation that the California Energy Commission does through their transparent and open stakeholder processes to get that input back. On the pure electricity side, for example, I'll just use that as a corollary, is that, in the day-to-day process of looking at the forecast and looking at growth, we've had folks come up and say, well, hey, I have data centers that are really growing because now we have, we went through a period of work from home. A lot of people sat down and did a whole lot of Amazon shopping. So the data warehouses just exploded. So, but that is also kind of the boots on the ground information that is good for us doing, higher level planning to really understand that where is that growth? Why is that growth happening? So that we can do better planning. So I think that feedback loop is important. So there are all these great forums at the agencies, at CAISO, at the here as well, but also it is important to get that on the ground feedback. So I think that was a little bit of what I took away from the last convening that we had, is trying to understand where's that chicken and egg. But I also wanted to chime in that we are considering that, and there are processes in play to kind of break that that cycle so that we can get started. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Delphine. I had a clarifying question from Brandon. Brandon, do you want to ask that?
Yeah, Delphine, I live in both the energy and transportation worlds. And so I think for our folks in the transportation sector, they're probably a little bit confused. The CEC sort of has incentives and is doing forecasting, and the PUC has these transportation demand programs, like the Make Ready programs, just very generally. But then you're talking about, does the ISO actually do, when you talk about a distribution utility, is the ISO actually modeling the system? Could you maybe clarify what that means when you say distribution utility versus not?
Excellent. Great question, Brandon. And I'm sorry, I kind of glossed over that a little bit. So thank you for asking for clarification on that. So no, we work very closely with the distribution utility. So when we're doing our planning, it is at the high voltage wholesale level. So I just want to be clear. And I think what Kyle said is there are things that are happening on the distribution side that the CAISO is not part of. But ultimately, the other relationship to remember is CAISO, we're in the independent in the California independent system operator means we don't own any generation or transmission assets. So when it comes to the complicated issue of a PSPS and the utilities, the like PG&E, SDG&E, SCE, they own the actual transmission infrastructure. CAISO operates it, but if they said we need to de-energize this line for a safety purpose, CAISO just takes orders and we say, yes, that's what you need to do, and we will try to operate the system even without those major lines. So at the end of the day, really, it's the transmission owners that call the shots, but we manage and we plan for expansion. So let me talk a little bit about rolling that back into what we're talking about here in terms of the actual transportation side. So the first line of defense, if there's going to be some sort of expansion, is likely going to be on the utility, the distribution utility side. It can happen, but it's rare that fleets are plugging directly into the transmission side. That could happen. So that expansion would also flow through the CEC's forecasting, indicating a need, a greater load and a need for that expansion, and that would go directly to the CAISO. But for the most part, the planning is more or less on the distribution side. And as they plan and as they see further growth, they're going to communicate that back to the CEC, coordinate with them in their forecasting, and then, you know, it'll bubble up into the CAISO sphere. So I think the CAISO, typically when we see the impacts, we're secondary, we're seeing it after the distribution side. But I do want to note that it is important still, because I think because of the penetration of electrification of all sectors, not just transportation, that collective aggregation of load is quite high and will bubble up eventually to the transmission, the wholesale side. So we do want to work in lockstep. We don't want to be surprised that there's been tons of activity on the distribution side, and then one fine day we see, you know, a huge amount of demand bubble up to the transmission side. So we are working in lockstep to making sure that we can kind of track that and plan for that as we go along. So I hope that helps explain the relationship there.
And Aravind, did you have a clarifying question?
Yes. So if this is Arvind Kaila's Volvo Group North America, pleasure to be here again and be a part of this very rich discussion. My question, thanks for this information, by the way, Delphine, but if I'm talking to my fleets and if I'm planning a site for my fleets where they're putting 5 trucks or 10 trucks, I know we started the conversation with the utility, but could there be somebody else to engage at this point in these early discussions? I mean, I'm just trying to understand, because the utility is going to come back and it sounds like they're limited in terms of what they can do in a short amount of time. So how best can we engage CEC and CAISO, or do they have to be engaged at all in those types of discussions?
That's a good question. I think in your example of 5, even 10 trucks, and I don't quite know what the megawatt impact is, but oftentimes I think if we're talking at that scale, unless you are literally interconnecting at the wholesale, higher voltage level, I think for the most part, the vast majority of folks are going to be interconnecting on the distribution side at distribution voltages and scale. And so for them, I think it's critical that they are involved and they're kind of front and center in that, because it's going to kind of touch their system first. And if there's further upgrades that need to be made, yes, we are in constant coordination and conversation with them in our planning cycles, as well as through the CEC. But yes, I think the first point of touch is going to be more on the distribution side. And that, again, that might be a little bit different if we're talking about really large, maybe port scale investments, but then, that's kind of a little bit out of my depth. So I would have to, kind of call a friend to get that information. But I will also defer if there are distribution utilities on the line to opine on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So actually, I'd like to finish with our introductions, and then I think we are definitely headed in the right direction for these conversations. Clearly, good questions are getting queued up, and looking forward to the conversation. Let me segue now to Gia Vason at GoBiz to give their update, and then we will come back to these questions.
Great, thanks, Annalisa. Yeah, so GoBiz, for those that aren't familiar with GoBiz, we're intended to be kind of the primary point of contact for businesses that are looking to either establish or expand in California. So there's a number of different other kinds of things that happen: international investment, permitting, small business assistance, business investment services for site selection, a number of different kinds of things. I am I'm the assistant deputy director for the zero-emission vehicle market development group, and we really work on accelerating the market, just kind of in market development, just what's in the name there, by facilitating agency alignment and being this kind of nexus between the public and private sectors, really aimed at identifying and overcoming challenges and different opportunities together. And some of the key areas that we focus in on is related to what we're talking about here, ZEV readiness and kind of along those lines, permit streamlining, implementation of some of the legislation for processes and timelines that are required for installation of charging infrastructure. We lead the zero-emission vehicle market development strategy, which came out around a year ago and is kind of like, looking at providing a North Star for our principles and our kind of guiding principles and some of our objectives around how we want to develop this market. And then we're working with the various agencies, 29 of them actually, that touch ZEV, for updates and kind of moving that forward. A couple of current highlights on what we're working on: we are convening some meetings with some of the EVSPs and the utilities around interconnection timelines, something that we've run across often and regularly, when it comes to infrastructure deployment is interconnection timelines and permitting timelines. So kind of understanding that piece better and trying to unravel some of the challenges there as possible. We're also working on the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding that's coming through, the federal funding for the hydrogen hub. So coordinating the state on that. This is connected because California is really focused on this kind of zero and low carbon hydrogen. And so, the connection to the grid in terms of, utilizing the overproduction of renewables and the grid balancing and resilience opportunities. And also really thinking about, I'm interested in listening in on kind of the rates piece today. That's obviously plays a big role in electrolytic hydrogen and the ability to have in-state production. Then we're working, more broadly too on California's hydrogen framework. So this will be around kind of similar to the zero-emission vehicle market development strategy, the state's principles and priorities for hydrogen as part of our energy transition, and in transportation and also more broadly. So those are some of the highlights. I think in terms of reflections from when we last met, this similar to what Delphine was saying, is process and timing for upgrades and expanding the grid and this grid resilience and readiness. And it was really interesting to hear, from everyone, particularly for me, the utilities around this timing and readiness for that. What stood out is this kind of need, and Delphine touched on this in much better detail than I did and outline than I will, around this need for aligning the pace and the readiness for a zero emission vehicle adoption, and really needing to be in lockstep so that the grid is just ahead of the needs of infrastructure, not getting out too far ahead of it, or certainly not being behind the needs. And so I think there's a great recognition of this, and it's already been sort of stated perfectly, I think, so I don't need to say more, but there's a lot of moving parts, and it really just underscores the need for to continue to help create better certainty and timelines for development, and understanding and being prepared for the various scenarios that may present as we go forward. So today I'm just really looking forward to continuing this conversation and taking away some additional ways that GoBiz can help simplify and better align the system. And often that happens to be more on the human side of things, right? Not the technical side, but just really great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gia. And so we're going to move into our discussion topics.
Hey, Annalisa, I had one really quick update, I know.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I wanted to put a plug in for the Energize program. Probably everybody on the call is aware of it, but they are, and I'm going to just put this in the chat. Energize.org is opening for its very first round of funding on 9 o'clock in the morning on March 23rd. I just put the hotline number and the website in the chat to find out more information, but it's for the very first, there's 4 lanes of funding. The first lane of funding is the EV fast track, where applicants in this funding lane are basically, they're ready to go. And they have prior experience with ZEB deployments. But so if you need more information, go to the website. And also I understand that Amy Grower, one of the folks on the Energize team, is on the call. And if she's wants to put more information about that in the Q&A, please do so. Otherwise, the hotline and the website should get you what you need. So thanks, Annalisa.
Thank you, Leslie. Sorry, I missed that on our agenda. Okay, so we have a couple of topic items on our agenda to cover today. As we have with previous meetings, we're going to set the stage with some introductory remarks. We're going to keep that short, and then we have some sort of opening questions. Leslie's going to facilitate our 2 topic areas. And we ask that you raise your hand to ask questions, make comments. We will potentially be asking follow-up questions. I wish in this format there were a way to know who had a good immediate comeback to a comment, or not comeback, that sounds, that doesn't sound quite right, but an immediate response. That would be easier if we were in a room together, but we'll do our best to keep the conversation moving in a logical forum. And also, if you are a participant that's not on the panel, we absolutely welcome your questions through the Q&A, and we will try and answer those real time. And I've got folks that are monitoring those. If there's a theme going with a particular issue, we'll bring that into the discussion. And okay, Catherine's going to share the agenda, and also a reminder that after this meeting is complete and we have the video processed, we'll be uploading it to our YouTube site. The delay in that is usually in getting the captions added. But those have been going up pretty quickly. And yeah, I think we're ready to go.
Yeah.
Take it away, Leslie.
Yeah, I'll start this off. First of all, thank you, Catherine, for sharing the agenda, and we'll be then asking her to very quickly pull up a presentation. But in the meantime, we really heard a lot at the last work group meeting about just the timing of the interconnect and to get infrastructure ready. We heard a lot about that, and then the need, of course, for the fleets to reach out very early to the utilities. And we also appreciate CEC and CPUC and CAISO and CARB, all of us working together to help better understand what the near and long-term electrification challenges are going to be on the grid side. But at the utility side, I have to first acknowledge what a daunting task this really has been for the utilities in having to ramp up and prepare for transportation electrification as quickly as they have, just starting with, the very first round of funding or funding for transportation electrification. So giving a lot of credit and kudos for getting staffing up, for getting the communication channels open and all of the client support structure that they've put in place to provide the service to their fleet clients. So I want to actually start if you can move over to the LADWP presentation now. Yemen Neni, I'd like to introduce him. He's graciously agreed to give us, to explain to us how the rate structures work, the interconnection process and timeline. And I just want to hand the mic over to Yemen if you're ready, because you're going to be able to explain this a lot better than I am. But then after Yemen speaks, I'd like for, if some of the utility panelists can chime in and provide any nuances that maybe are different from your process. Not a lot of time because we're already running over, but appreciate just hearing from you. And then I want to really open up the questions very specifically to those fleets to allow them to get some of their really critical questions answered about interconnection in this process. So from there, Yemen, can you test your mic?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Leslie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, thank you to you, Leslie, and the rest of the CARB team for inviting us today to get the municipal perspective. My name is Yamin Nani. I'm the manager of distribution system development for the Department of Water and Power and the power system. Previously, I've been in this role for 6 months. Previously, I was responsible for the day-to-day activity for the electric transportation program at LADWP, and in that stint, we were able to increase the city of LA's charging infrastructure by 5-fold, believe it or not, over the last 3 years. Largely thanks to the California Air Resources programs that have provided funding, including the California carbon allowances and the low carbon fuel standards program. Next slide, please. So I'd like to now get into the presentation. So essentially, when we talk about interconnection for electric vehicle charger, it really involves a 3-way close coordination between the utility, the electric vehicle charging installers or developers, and then also now the fleet operator, or now our customers. They're going to be also very closely involved because now they're essentially using electricity as a fuel for their vehicles. So next slide, please. Okay. Now, before I get into the process and timeline, I just wanted to use this kind of, apologize for this cartoonish kind of graphic, but I think it kind of gives a pretty good picture of what's involved from the utility to serve an electric vehicle charging load. And this kind of feeds onto what, some of the questions that were being asked of Delphine with regards to, how is EV charging served from a distribution utility? Now, DWP is a vertically integrated utility. We do have generation, transmission, and distribution. But what we're talking about here is really serving our customers, EV charging customers, from our distribution system. And DWP operates 2 voltages on its distribution system. One voltage is a higher voltage of 34,500 volt voltage, which we also call our sub-transmission voltage. This is a very high-powered, robust distribution system that can serve very large loads. And then our 4.8 kV system, which is our lower distribution system voltage, and typically, we see that voltage serving smaller loads, typically in the range of 3 to 400 kilowatts or less. And then if you look here on the right side of this pictorial, so everything, so we have overhead power lines, we have underground power lines, we have underground structures that are involved in serving EV charging load. And then after, on the customer's property, there's also equipment involved, be it distributions, transformers, electrical switches, the meters needed for revenue and billing, and then also, obviously the EV chargers, along with other structures that might be there, such as utility poles or utility pads. The next slide, please. So the way DWP, we have a dedicated service planning division, and within that division, there's actually a dedicated group that handles electric vehicle charging interconnection requests. The way this categorized requests based on how the complexity and the duration that it takes to serve that new load is 3 ways. So one, which they call a tier 1 project. Essentially, this is typically happens when it's a much smaller installation. Let's say, in the anywhere in the 10 to 40 level 2 chargers, or you're talking about with high capacity chargers, maybe 1, 2, or maybe 3 maximum fast chargers. Typically, if we do have capacity on the grid already, we conduct a very cursory review of the capacity available to serve that load. And if we determine that there is adequate capacity, within 3 weeks, we issue an facility adequacy letter saying, okay, we already have the capacity needed to serve your load. You can go ahead and construct and build your EV chargers. Now then, when it comes to a slightly larger loads, where there might be some minor utility side upgrades. So now these are what we identify as a tier 2 project or type 2 project. And that involves, potentially some upgrades of a utility transformer, the service cable coming down to provide power to the charging station. And that involves a little bit more work. That can take anywhere from 4 months up to 12 months, depending on the complexity and the amount of equipment that needs to be upgraded. And then we get into a much more complex, much longer duration type of project, a tier 3, which essentially is either a new installation, and this could be the type for many of these trucks that are converting over, because typically they, where these vehicles are parked is going to be somewhere away from the building load where the electricity service is provided. This is going to be a new service, a new installation of power, and these can take up to 18 to 24 months for LADWP to potentially extend the distribution line to get to where the charging stations are going to be. If it involves converting our system from overhead to underground, that can be also very complex and timely. And again, we're talking about a construction timeline of minimum 4 months, sometime going into 6 months or more. Okay, so that's kind of lays out how we handle the type of categories and how long each of them might take. The next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of show one example of a type 2 project somewhere in the middle, and what that involves. So what we're talking about here is potentially a request for EV charging that triggers a minor upgrade on LADWP's distribution system that involves upgrading a transformer, the service cable that's going to the switchgear that serve the existing loads on the customer's facility, and then potentially having to possibly upgrade that switchgear, the service panel, and also adding a new meter for those that's dedicated for those EV chargers. Okay, so just kind of depict what's involved in serving these new loads. Okay, next slide. Now we'll get into the timeline and the process involved. So the process really starts with the initial customer submittal, right? So typically, a fleet customer if they don't have their own engineering in-house, they're going to be working with an EV supply equipment installer or designer, and they're going to develop, you know, a system plan for where they're going to install the chargers, an electrical diagram, and a load schedule, and they're going to submit that to LADWP. Now, what we do also provide, we started providing this about a couple of years ago, is a feasibility study option where if a customer is really just in the very, very early stages of this process and just trying to get just kind of a barometer reading for where, you know, what they're going to have to do, what the utility has to supply them. We do provide an option for a feasibility study where you simply just have to tell us how many chargers you want to connect, where you're going to connect them, and how much, you know, power each charger is going to draw. And we'll conduct a feasibility study and tell you, you know, whether we have capacity to serve you or not, and or if we're going to have to upgrade that system, how long it's going to take to upgrade it, and how much it's going to cost. So if you do elect with that, then we move on to the design stage, and that can take design and permitting. That can take anywhere from 2 to 3 months. You know, you're typically working. We assign an engineer to work on your project. They'll be working with your contractor, and then also your contractor will be pulling permits from the Department of Building and Safety or other authority having jurisdiction. And then once that initial design stage is complete, then the customer will start building on their side of the meter. The utility will start doing any upgrades necessary. Some of that work can happen in parallel and can be shortened as you know, if close coordination is conducted with the customer contractor. But essentially, we're looking at a project that could take anywhere from 6 to 8 months for completion and energization of the EV chargers. Okay, now I was also asked to kind of talk about what the utility is doing in terms of infrastructure funding support, as well as rates. So what we've done in the last 3-4 years or so, we've offered a very large amount of the funding that we have been getting from the LCFS program to our customers to basically offset the initial cost of installing EV infrastructure. So we've offered rebates over $90 million in the last 2 fiscal years. Our fiscal year is from July to June, and then this fiscal year we're keeping on track. We've already released about $20 million, and we plan to release another 20 million more. Now these cover the whole suite of electric vehicle charging from light duty for level 2 to DC fast charging, and we even have a dedicated carve out for fleet charging, that what we call the medium and heavy duty charging program. Okay, and we intend to continue those programs as long as we are getting funding, through those programs. Now, the other thing I was asked to discuss is what is DWP doing to prepare its grid for the onslaught of EV charging. And really, we are just in the very early stages, and there's going to be, a lot more to go. So essentially what we've done is we've taken a really proactive approach, and we do want to get ahead of the request. So we anticipate that there's going to be about anywhere from 8 to 1,400 megawatts of EV charging load coming onto our grid in the next 8 to 9 years. So what we're doing is we incorporated that forecast into our substation forecast, and we are proactively implementing projects in areas where we know we anticipate at least those vehicles coming, this vehicle charging coming. And we're upgrading our distribution lines, we're upgrading our distribution stations, and then we're also looking into a voltage conversion project that's going to provide a higher voltage and be able to serve more electric vehicle charging. And we're anticipating potentially building about 10 new distribution stations in the next 14 years. Now, just to give you a perspective, DWP has only built about 2 new distribution stations in the last 30 years. So we're really ramping up our infrastructure activity in order to be able to accommodate EV load. Next slide, please. And so, we've, in order to put our money where our mouth is, we are going to our board in the near future in May to support a large expansion of our vehicle program. Right now, we have authority to spend $40 million a year coming from various funding sources, but now we're actually going to be really ramping that up. We're looking to spend about $700 million on various EV programs over the next 8 to 9 years. And a large portion of that is for the grid readiness, beefing up our distribution system, about $250 million. It's that orange slice right there is really preparing our distribution system, proactively preparing the distribution system to meet the EV charging loads. Next slide, please. And then another thing we are doing is, we really heard from our customers the concerns about, peak demand chargers that are going to affect the ability to charge their vehicles. So we've really come up with a really unique EV contract rate that allows you to really benefit from load shifting and charging during certain times of the period, but at the same time recognizes that some operations may have to charge at certain times of the day, and so we've kind of restructured our peak demand charges to really not penalize you for an entire year for one-time peak charge. We've implemented a new monthly demand charge rate based on the surges in your charging activity. So happy to provide more information or link anyone who's interested about this rate with our folks at DWP. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yaman. At this point, because I want to make sure that we have be able to get to questions that are specific to electrification and interconnection, I want to get those right to questions from our fleet partners. If you have specific questions that you want to maybe direct to your utility, we do have a lot of representatives. We pretty much have probably over 90% of the state covered here with Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, PG&E, LADWP, and the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. So since Eddie has had his hand raised this whole time, I'm going to let you start.
Thanks, Leslie.
Your arm must be getting tired.
No, thanks. How's the sound quality? Because I'm in an empty room and it echoes a little bit on my end. So kind of a rhetorical question for all the agencies that have spoken already, which is, what's the total amount of energy that we're going to need to decarbonize this transportation sector? I've heard different numbers, 350 million megawatts, and I've heard 350 megawatts, and I've heard over 1 million megawatts. So it's a very important number, because whether we're talking about electricity or hydrogen, it helps to frame both what the demand's going to be and also the planning aspect of it, because if it's part of it's electric, part of it's hydrogen, then we start being able to divide up along the freight corridors, where we need to plan for this. So I don't know if anyone has that number, but if they did, that'd be great to hear it. I've heard different projections. So regarding some of the questions on the agenda, I think we all need to think.
Eddie, we're going to get to the questions at the very end. I really do want to keep the conversation focused specifically on the interconnection topic right now. These were the agenda items that we missed the last time, but we will be revisiting a lot of those really big questions. I'm sorry to cut you off there, but I just want to stay on track with this agenda. So if you have a question specific to the topic at hand right now, otherwise we definitely will go back to the
okay, so here's the question, because I had more comments. So are we talking about fleets in the common term, meaning a fleet like owned by one company, or are we talking about the 60 or 70% of the trucks that are owned by small operators and may have 1 to 3 trucks? Because they're two completely different models. And so if we're talking about the large fleets, then I think we're right on track. If we're talking about the small independent operators, I think we have to have a completely separate conversation. So
if there is what utility territory, or does one of our utilities want to respond to how maybe they work with or collaborate with the small independent owner operators, or small fleets versus the larger fleets? Is there a utility partner that wants to speak to that if there's a different process? I'm not seeing a hand just yet.
There is no way to work with a small independent operator. The model's broken for them.
Yeah, and that's the point of Energize at this point, because there is there's a lot of really important handholding that goes on there. So let's see. I see Yaman with his hand raised. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to mention the feasibility process. I think it's a really helpful process for small fleet operators, because if they're just, if they don't have a contractor on board yet or a designer, and they just kind of want to get an idea, right, of where, what is it going to take to interconnect, right? We require very minimal information, right? We say, okay, how many chargers do you want to have? What's the power rating? And we know the standards. We can help them out with that. I mean, it's very minimal information. For a small fee, they can submit that request for feasibility study and at least get started to understand, okay, it's going to take, X number of months to bring me power, and it's going to cost X number of dollars to upgrade the utility infrastructure in order to install chargers in my yard, right? So I think that's a very valuable service that we are providing, and other utilities have similar advisory service as part of their electric transportation program.
Yeah, that was kind of my point, Leslie, is the independent operator doesn't have a yard.
Yeah, I know.
Public fueling, so, okay.
Yeah, and definitely, we definitely understand that, as do all of our programs and systems in place to fund infrastructure. So I do encourage you to get involved with that Energize process and the work groups that they will have continuing to go on, because I think that's really an important mechanism that we have in place.
Did you want to call from PG&E, Dean?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, hi Leslie. Thank you for this moment, and Eddie, good to see you. So I did want to let you know that we are supporting our small business customers. We have customers with as little as 2 vehicles that they're looking to acquire up to 5 years into the future. So PG&E, we provide a design resource and an electrical engineer. And when we do offer the customer participation in our program, we offer them with a contract that shows what are the incentives that we're going to provide them for their behind the meter infrastructure, what type of free utility upgrades they're going to get, and potentially what rebates they can get for their chargers. It also includes a preliminary design, which they can take out to a contractor for a bid to put in that behind the meter service. And if they have any questions, or the contractor has questions about the design, we have an electrical engineering staff and design staff that we'll bring on board and have a call with that customer and their contractor and walk them through the design, so they have a good understanding of how to do their side of the work and what PG&E is going to do. In addition, once the contract is signed with the customer, we assign a PG&E project manager to coordinate the construction schedule with them and their contractor. So there's a lot of hand-holding that we do to try to help these small business customers, because they don't have those resources like a BNSF. So we are reaching out, we're trying to do our best, we're learning from the process, and we certainly want to do more if we can.
Thank you so much, Dean. Want to call on Ava. Do you have a utility specific question?
Yeah, thank you. This is Eva Pleiser at San Diego County Water Authority, and I recently switched entities. So you've heard me speak on this representing Rancho California Water District, that as of Monday, I am now with San Diego County Water Authority. And, I'm really glad to hear what the LEWP said, and I saw that there's a representative from San Diego Gas and Electric. And I also saw in the Q&A that a lot of people would like to know, is this process, the feasibility process, offered by everybody? Being a small fleet with both agencies that I was with have small fleets, 85 vehicles, and about 50 of them each are the heavy duty. We don't have the expertise. We will need assistance developing these. Currently, my yard can't even accommodate a single charging station. We just have no rooms. We will have to move. So how do I engage with the utilities, with San Diego Gas and Electric, to make sure that when I move, I go, build, go to a site that has enough room to put in the infrastructure I'm going to need to eventually go 100% electric. So that's a big concern and a big question. And everything I've heard this morning so far, as far as infrastructure and deployment, I would say that'll be my biggest concern. My second biggest concern is as this rule comes into place, and hopefully you've heard enough to kind of give you an idea that maybe making it a longer implementation period. The other concern is having available contractors to actually do this work, because we don't want to be in a position where there's no contractors available to do this work and we can't comply with the deadlines because we can't get charging infrastructure, we can't get the vehicles and everything else. So that's another concern, is having the people out there to actually do this work. Cost, as always, I'm a public water utility, so I will always whine about cost. Because that's going to be a tremendous concern, given everything that we have to deal with with the human right to water and making sure that we keep water affordable. So seeing these programs available there. And my last question would be in terms of rates. So I saw that there's rates being offered, and this is the concern that I have, having experienced the NEM process and seeing how the devaluation of the NEM asset has happened. How will this be handled, given that in essence, our utility providers for energy are monopolies, and we don't have, this would be a bigger question for the CPUC and others. How will you make sure that there's competitive costs? Because right now I can go to multiple gasoline stations and get whatever diesel I want. If I don't like this one, I go to that one, I might get 10, 15 cents off. I won't have that choice anymore. How do I manage my costs long-term through the rates and not, and we have lots of good partnerships with San Diego Gas and Electric, and we enjoy working with them. But, in the long term, how do we make sure that the costs don't escalate where this becomes a financial issue for us because there's no competition for the fuel?
Thank you. Those are all really fantastic questions. And I know we have a couple of folks from San Diego Gas and Electric on the line. If you could maybe respond to her first question, if you're here.
Hi, this is Dinah. Is it okay if I speak?
Yes, please.
Yes. Hi. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Eva, for your question. Regarding your interest for any of your electric vehicle projects, I did put it in the chat. Please contact us right away, scgne.com/mdhd-interest-form. And no matter what size your project, whether it's, a minor, a medium, a large project, we have a dedicated team in our Power Your Drive for Fleets program that will address all of your questions. And like PG&E, we will have someone that is assigned as a customer service advisor that will take you from the initiation all the way to the energization. Our team, luckily, our team is small, our utility is smaller, so therefore we have a dedicated smaller team. And so we are able to, we meet formally on a weekly basis and ad hoc as needed. And so just reach out. I think you had some other questions regarding rates. We do have an electric vehicle high powered rate for customers who are over 20 kW, and similar to LADWP, it is the demand charge is actually a monthly subscription charge. And then there are energy charges associated with that. And
you're jumping ahead on that because we're going to talk about rate structures in the next session.
All right, I'll end with that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I just want to let folks know that to check back at the Energize website, because they are going to have a portal with contractors. So if you're to your question, Eva, about availability of people to actually do the work and do the installations, they're going to be collecting quite a plethora of available, a database or an inventory of contractors who are able to do this. So I would like to be courteous here and move on to Chris Shimoda.
Thank you, Leslie, and good morning, everyone. So I don't know who this question is specifically targeted to, but any of the utilities feel free to chime in. So how does the new service request work with respect to timing on fleet acquisition of vehicles? And to clarify what I mean, I'll just say, let's say we have a depot with 100 vehicles that are on a, roughly 10 to 15 year replacement cycle. And the fleet intends to convert those vehicles to zero emissions, but incrementally over a 10 to 15 year timescale, maybe even a 15 to 20 year time frame. Would the utility want the new service request to come in for all 100, or are we, potentially looking at incremental projects for a portion of the fleet and then coming back in for an upgrade? How do you, intend to communicate to customers about how they should present their projects to you?
Looking for a hand raise from a utility on this one. I see Yemen there. Yemen, did you want to respond to Chris's question?
Yeah, Chris, no, thank you. That's a really good question. So from DWP's perspective, I mean, we would love to know the long-term plan. That would be better than piecemealing, your electrification plan to us, because what we could do then is we could look at a more of a long-term approach to serving your ultimate, load and understand, okay, what is it going to take for us to upgrade the infrastructure to serve that ultimate load? And then in the meantime, what we can do is provide you a temp service, right, to meet your initial phase of electrification. So if you are planning that far ahead for full electrification and want to engage us in that discussion, that would be more than ideal for us. So but ultimately, what we could do is essentially, let you know what it's going to take, how much it's going to take to upgrade the infrastructure, how long it's going to take, and then, and go from there.
Okay, got it. So to clarify, and in any other utility, if they have a different perspective, I'd be happy to hear it. But if you have an end goal in mind, that should be part of, I don't know how, flexible a new service request is. Is it that you're talking to a live person? Are you submitting, just that baseline of information that I think Dean had described? Maybe a little bit more detail about exactly how that you prefer that to be communicated from the fleet side.
Maybe if Eric wants to chime in from SMUD.
Yeah, Chris, I appreciate your question there, and I was about to just echo Yaman's comments there. And it was mentioned earlier that each of the, certainly the investor-owned, but us as well, we are rolling out our own advisory, the SMUD eFuel advisory service as well. And that's intended to be the first place for any fleet to go to. And every customer has a strategic account advisor that is their touch point for any and all questions related to electrification. And that SAA is we're already training them up to basically, share and educate with their customers about this. That includes our commercial, and fleet customers, including smaller and medium businesses as well. So that's kind of their first place to start. And depending on what they're looking for, and to Yaman's point, it is best if they have a long range plan. It's certainly best to address that in its wholeness, rather than piecemealing it out, because obviously we can develop along with them a more future-proof plan that is far more cost efficient than it might otherwise be to do it in a piecemeal manner. Now, that said, a lot of these businesses, don't even know where to start, and it might just be an education, and piece of it initially. And the idea is to have that conversation early and to elaborate exactly that need, that you may have contacted us as a small business because you heard about this and you needed some more information about what the regulatory requirements are and compliance requirements. And from there, we can then begin to educate about, let's not look at just the next piece of your budget on your replacement cycle. Let's look at your entire budget over the entire replacement cycle for your fleet. And let's see how we can electrify that in optimized and appropriate manner and in a cost efficient way. The sooner we can have those discussions with everybody, the better off it is for everyone.
Got it.
Boy,
Thank you.
Words of wisdom.
and Leslie, I apologize, just one quick follow-up. I think to the prior two commenters, and this does have to do with interconnect and potential bottlenecks. So I know in the draft SIP, there are some updated numbers from heavy load in the plan. And the forecast for 2035 is 210,000 chargers needed between 19 kilowatts and 1.6 megawatt potential capacity. Plausible peak demand from those chargers, just to give you the scale of how much electricity we're talking about, is anywhere between 8 to 11 gigawatts at peak. I used a specific duty cycle. That's kind of a rough approximation, but it gives you an idea of scale. Historical peak demand in the state is roughly 50 gigawatts. And so given the other demands, I know the utilities are under a lot of demand for electrification from other sectors of the economy, a lot of regulatory requirements as well. Is there any discussion about plausible bottlenecks in your system with respect to either labor, engineering, materials? I'll just say that we've all collectively learned a lot about certain system limitations. I'll just say we didn't foresee that a bottleneck at microprocessor production would result in heavy duty equipment manufacturers and a lot of manufacturers for that matter not being able to produce product. And so are those discussions occurring with respect to the amount of actual physical work and materials that is going to need to be performed over this time horizon?
I think that's a really good question, Chris. And is there somebody perhaps from one of either Edison or PG&E that can speak to that? We haven't heard from them yet. I was just curious if or if another utility can respond to that question about bottlenecks.
Yeah, I can certainly speak to that if we don't have anyone else. But Chris, you're absolutely right. I can certainly speak for SMUD, and I'm sure this is probably true at the other utilities, that these are hard conversations that are being had today with our grid planning groups. And there's been over the many years, right, we've had light duty vehicles in the market now for something like 10 years, and they've mostly been hovering around the 2% penetration mark, and then in the last 5 years really started to make some inroads. And that in itself, now that we're at here in Sacramento, 10% uptake, 12%, and going north almost 13% in the state. And with all of the plans that have been highly publicized by the automakers, right, to electrify, this is now, I think, getting on the radar, if you will, in a more serious way for our distribution planning groups. And we're having these hard conversations about, we've traditionally, our model is based on customers coming to us when they are looking to energize, and or when they're looking, toward the latter stage of deployments. And we have to flip that on its head, which is a bit antithetical to the way we've always done business. So it's really forcing some, tough conversations here about how we're going to do that, how we're going to proactively build out these grid upgrades in advance, the kind of conversations Yaman was just touching on in terms of increasing budgets. A lot of that is resource, labor resources, and those have some lead times associated with them too that aren't exactly, something we can staff up with that kind of skilled labor in the span of 2 or 3 months. It actually sometimes takes on the order of years. So these are conversations being had, and that's about the best I can, kind of at a higher level provide for, for Chris. But maybe there's some of the other, utilities may have, more detail they can offer on that.
I just want to chime in that this is still new to everybody from my observation, but at the same time, as you've heard from our panelists from CEC and PUC specifically, and integration with the CARB data, that connection and all of that modeling work is also being picked up by the utilities. So I think this is going to be an ever improving, evolving process to really wrap our brains around this and understand what the challenges are, and having all of the state agencies work together as they have done is going to result in probably a very sound and well thought out holistic solution. I guess that's my goal and wish for this process. But
and Leslie, I just want to quickly mention that there's something like 14 regional blueprints that are being put together, blueprint plans that are being funded by the Energy Commission throughout the state, including here in Sacramento, which is designed, these are medium heavy duty ZEV infrastructure blueprints, which is exactly designed to motivate all the regional agencies and partners to coordinate and try to, we're in the process of really trying to determine how these loads are going to look, where they're going to land spatially in our territory or our region, and what kind of infrastructure we're going to need to put in place, as well as what kind of workforce needs we're going to need in order to do that.
Yeah, I think hearing from everybody today should be giving some of our fleets and other stakeholders a little bit of reassurance that what's going on behind the scenes, that we are really collectively working together to try to solve this problem. Do we have any? Let's see, I do want to make sure we have time for the next discussion where we're going to be talking about rate structures and load management. And just to make sure we cover that subject, and then there will be time until 12 o'clock today to continue this discussion of wherever it leads. There's a few questions that I'm going to want to have to ask at the end, but I certainly might not bring all of them up. So at this point, I'd like to transition, and then we will basically take raise hands in the order received after that. And then one last thing before I hand the mic over to Kathy, we did post in the chat, or Brandon posted in the chat, all of the transportation electrification web pages from the various utilities. So I want to encourage you to look there, find your utility, and see where you can get more information as needed. Catherine, I'm going to hand the mic over to you now.
Great. Can you guys hear me? Wonderful. I wanted to transition now to rates, and I am so excited to hear about all of the work that the CPUC does. That they have an en banc process where they look at that rates, and I'd like to introduce Masood. And my apologies if I'm not saying your name correctly. He's going to talk a little bit about his work he does at the CPUC and how they look at the rates, and then they're able to kind of think about what's needed moving forward, and then talk a little bit about that thought about moving away from rates that include demand charges and looking at things like subscription rates. Please take it away, Masood.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Kathleen, and you pronounced my name perfectly.
Oh, goodness.
Glad to be here. Actually, my colleague coworker Achintia, who is on the race team, is also online. So feel free to jump in, Achintia. But what I wanted to talk about, as as our policy, just a little bit about policy, and then specifically about the race that we have already in place and where we're going with this. So if you look at the roadmap of the policies, the race that we've had, we started with the residential time of use, wanted to introduce time differentiation into rates for all customers. That's in place. San Diego has completed PG&E and SCE. They're about to finish it in the next few months. But we feel like after that, the next step was for us to move past the time of use. We started having these boutique rates, mostly for the EV adoptions. The goal was and is to make sure that the rates that for electrical vehicles can is comparable and beats the real fuel rates. These days is not that hard, but we're trying to make it EV adoption more interesting and promote our EV goals. There are already EV rates in each of the three large IO utilities. PG&E has a CEV rate, San Diego, EVHP, SCE. Again, all of these rates have different rate structure. For SCE, they did this, they removed the demand charge. We call it a demand charge holiday. They removed the demand charge for commercial clients who can, mostly for fleets and EV stations. For San Diego and PG&E, the rates took a form of subscription. So basically, we are reducing we're changing, instead of a demand charge model, to a subscription model. These rates are set in a way that there are, in addition to subscription, there is lower volumetric. Most of these rates are subsidized, meaning that, again, as the goal of the PUC to promote EV adoption, we are taking that approach. So these things have been going on. Now, the next step that we feel like, the next thing that we want to do, and this is, we've had few workshops, and it came up on the on-bank. We had another workshop on a proposal called Unite proposal, which is a white paper done by Energy Division, focuses on load flexibility, and we're trying to incorporate time varying, real-time dynamic rates, and real-time pricing. So we feel like the real-time pricing, where the price of electricity changes hourly, is the next step. And the real-time pricing has been done in other jurisdictions. We feel like we can pass on the savings to the customers. It helps the grid. It helps electrification. This is the direction that we're going. We already have few pilots and rates in the large IOUs. Again, most of these pilots are specific to the IOU. The heavy emphasis on these pilots and these rates are for measurements and evaluation, and marketing and education. We want to learn from these rates to see how customers adopt these rates, how easy it is to use them, how much load they move, and how they benefit. Also, we want to know that what's the impact on the grid is. Moving past this, we are working, and again, this was reflected in our DER action plan, which hasn't been approved, but it's been publicized as the main goal of the PUC is by 2023 or 2024, we have a variety of rate options to the customers, which are fair and equitable, and also they are good for the system and good for the electrification. You will see more and more rulemaking coming up from us, and more rates for the that is going that way. Not sure if there's any question or if anything that you want me to, or anybody wants me to elaborate or.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. Thanks for talking about how moving away from that time of use and going toward the future. I'd like to open it up. The first hand I saw raised was from Thomas. So Thomas, please ask your question.
Hi. One of the concerns that we have moving with the new rate structures is, I'm sorry, by way of introduction, my name is Thomas Yellench with Pacific Merchant Shipping Association. We represent marine terminals and ocean carriers in California's ports. Within the port complex, we have highly structured operating hours that are governed by coastwise entire U.S. coast collective labor agreements. And so our ability to charge at different times in the future to accommodate different pricing models is extremely limited. What we expect the future to look like is we currently have a 3-shift structure, and we expect that we'll use the 3rd shift to charge equipment, and we will need equipment that's able to get through the 1st and 2nd shifts. Right now, from what we're hearing of what a 3rd shift charging, we expect rates to be significantly higher at the night when renewable is no longer won't be available. And given the supply chain, not just in California, but across the country, that is what we're stuck with. And that poses significant economic costs for this industry and Californians in terms of moving goods. And I'd be interested to hear CPUC's thoughts on how we approach a rate structure that is cognizant of the collective labor agreements that we have, and the very structured work conditions that we have in California's ports.
So again, I have to think about exactly what as I said, that our goal is to have a variety of rates. Thomas, when we talk about rates, the advantage of a real-time pricing, again, each of these rates work for somebody. For each of these rates that we talk about, there are people who are benefiters and who are not benefiters. So we're going to have rates with high fixed charges that will help people who are not being able to move, or as you said, they're not flexible, moving their loads. I think the high fixed charge rate with low volumetric would help that. If there are dynamic rates, again, the dynamic rates is the rates that the electricity goes, it changes per hour, and there are opportunities to take advantage of that with the technology. I'm not sure what else I can offer as an answer.
So if I may jump in,
Please do.
I think, yeah, one of the points, one of the goals with widespread real-time rates is also cost containment. As Masood, just to jump off on what Masood was saying, there are some customers that will be able to respond to them and some may not. And it's not necessarily that we're going to mandate everyone have one specific kind of rate. But as there is a large growth in demand and a large growth in just load in general, flexibility of the grid is essential to make sure that costs for everyone are reduced. So that is part of goal in going forward with the rate reform ideas that CPUC has expressed throughout our action plan and our goals of promoting more price responsive rates.
Thank you, Richard.
Yes, we have a hand raise from Mike Tennell from ATA. Will you please open your mic?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I have a similar question. You mentioned that the rates are subsidized for EVs currently, and I'm just wondering, kind of wanting more detail on that and how you see this transition going. How are you subsidizing the rates, and how long will you be able to do that? What time period will we get to that going away?
So the part of the again, as I said, a lot of the emphasis that we have on these boutique rates and the pilots are evaluation, and we do want to see whether there is any cost shift or not. The goal is by electrifying and once more and more people go to these rates, the cost comes down and then it pays off. This is by when when electricities when IOUs sell more kilowatt hours, then that would bring up the price. That's the goal of the electrification that we're following. So each of these is, when I say subsidized, for when we remove, for example, San Diego Gas and Electric, they has this EVHP rate, which has a sunset year of 10 years. First 3 years, there is no additional, we call it the EPMC. For 3 years, we do not add that. And then as year 4, we start adding that back to the rate. By year 10, that's going to be a full rate. So depends on what the rates are, and we do, as we design these rates, there are a lot of discussions internally and with the parties regarding how much we can afford, what the impact on the non-adopters are. So it's not an answer that I can tell that by such and such date we're going to be done with this. But for the boutique rates that we have done, they are all going to be back to normal rates in the next probably 10 years. Again, SCE, when I said that they go a demand charge holiday, it was a 10-year period that we said we're not going to, for EV charging stations, they're not going to pay demand charge for 10 years. And after 10 years, it'll go back to the normal.
I would like to call on Ruben from Southern California Edison to kind of, Masood, thank you so much for that larger picture of the CPUC. And Ruben, please speak specifically to answer Mike's question on what you guys are doing at Southern California Edison.
Hi, good morning. Can you guys see me and hear me well? Awesome, thank you. Hi, Masood. Hi, Chinthia. And Mike, so at SC, as Masood noted, we have this 10-year transition period. And the purpose, when we think about rates, we're really thinking about how do we enable market transition. We know that the medium duty and the whole EV sector as a whole is an evolving and emerging market. And as markets emerge, pricing plays a good part in helping and complementing how these markets emerge. So from our standpoint at SE, we're acutely hinged on enabling this transition. And in so much as we're enabling this transition, we recognize that site utilization, load factors are going to improve over time. And so where we are today might not be where we are in 10 years. And so the way we've structured our rates, as Masood pointed out, is we said, okay, let's go easy on demand charges for the first 5 years to allow the market to kind of like stabilize, get its feet wet, if you will. And then as utilization improves, we're hoping that from year 6 through 10, we have a linear projection of a gradual increase to what we then call a normal state of demand charges in year 10. Part of why we think that's appropriate, because at the onset, we're making our best guess on what these transition timelines look like. However, in our most recent GRC, in the 2021 GRC, we recognize that the feedback we're getting from the industry at large is that they're still grappling with utilization as a big concern in terms of how they can evolve their site charging restrictions or constraints, be it wait times, be it their fleet, be it what they're trying to do with their specific site. And so we in our 2021 GRC actually proposed to the commission that we'd like to get a 2-year extension to allow the market to kind of get its feet a little bit more wet. So I think when we think about rates for us in these markets, it's how do rates also enable the market transition, and then, as Masood pointed out, focus on cost, be transparent and conscientious about cost causation, but also balance the principles on, well, where and how do we want rates to communicate pricing to our customers?
Thanks, Ruben.
Thank you. I wanted to also bring up, there was a question in the Q&A or the chat, forgot which one it was, I was reading both of those. And they were talking about real-time pricing and how there might not be ability to do that. And I wanted to not dive too much into that detail, but mention that Michael Truax was talking about the distributed energy, the DER study going out, CPUC is looking at. I know they're coordinating with the California Energy Commission on that. And then there's a number of software, as well as like battery storage, solar panels, all these kind of things that you can kind of, and so the more you have the humps and your load, then that's going to generally increase your bill at your meter. And so if you're able to somehow level it off or, peak shave, and that's something I know that large industrial facilities have been doing for years, looking at all kind of analysis on what's the best way to do that. So there's definitely tools out there that you can use, and you can go to that. And I wanted to make sure we're getting questions from the folks that have raised hands. And so I'd like to go to Matt again, and then Eva. And Eric, I see your hand up, so we'll go to you next. Thank you, Ruben.
Yeah, hi, I just wanted to add at least some perspective from us publicly owned utilities. We, like the other investor owns, have implemented our TOD rate across the territory for both residential and business customers. And we are we're rolling out a pilot commercial EV rate, which is scheduled to launch this July. And that was developed in response to concerns expressed by commercial customers over traditional demand charges, which are being seen by these early adopter site hosts as punitive. And they're perceived as punitive because of the phased nature of adoption, where only a portion of the fleet is using the chargers that are deployed, and usage is peaky in nature. And so in light of this, our rate employs a proven subscription style model of the kind that was described earlier to encourage commercial customers to transition to EVs and electric fuel. It does this by phasing in the fixed charges over time with increasingly discounted volumetric energy charges as charging equipment sees greater use. Or put another way, it's as utilization grows with EV adoption. And that rate targets fleets, station operators, workplaces, and others with at least 20 kW of EV load, applies to new and existing charging infrastructure, so long as they have a dedicated revenue meter, which we can easily install for them. That pilot will inform consideration of a permanent rate in 2025. And as for concerns over lack of competition that could push prices higher, SMUD is a community nonprofit, and we're governed by a 9-member elected board of directors that we're ultimately held accountable to. So we sell power at cost, and how we're recovering the cost of the electrical infrastructure required to support these increasing loads is we're essentially, like I described earlier, trading off lower fixed charges initially for higher volumetric charges in the early stages. And then we're kind of flipping those. Toward the later stage, you have much lower volumetric charges once you have a much higher uptake and usage of those chargers, and that more than offsets any increases in fixed charges over that time. So that's our approach.
Thank you, Eric. Matt, could you please open your mic and lower your hand and ask your question?
Thank you. Matt Schrapp with the Harbor Trucking Association. Appreciate the opportunity here, and thank you, staff from CEC and ARB, for putting this second follow-up together. Can appreciate it. Just a question, and perhaps I missed it in the discussions here when we talk about the subsidized rates for EV charging. Would that be, dependent upon each utility, and would that essentially timeline or clock start once a project is actually in the ground and the switch is flipped, so to speak? So would it vary fleet by fleet or location by location, depending on when they actually started the contract with the particular utility or at that particular site? Is my first question.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, and then let the heavy hands, the experts from CPUC and other utilities raise into that. So the CPUC has a process where they work with the IOUs, and they set the rates. And in the rates, there's kind of like this period of time of how long things go in like, for example, the holiday on the demand charges has been thrown up. So we heard on this is our continuation of our discussion. And we heard on that first meeting, Ruben from Southern California Edison was talking about how when they first put together that EV rate, they asked for a holiday on the demand charges for a certain period of time. And then based on input, they have a proposal. And Ruben, please speak up if I'm misstating this from memory, that you're asked the CPUC to consider your holiday to be extended for that EV rate. Ruben, I'm going to go ahead and call on you to answer that question.
Okay, I'm on. Sorry. Yeah, so I think it goes back to that same. The reason why we asked for the extension in the 2021 GRC was because we recognize that the market is taking longer to transition. I think from our standpoint, supporting the transition is very important to us. And in the earlier stages of fleet deployment, or in the earlier stages of site selection, you're always going to see situations where load factors are going to be low, and the consequence of fixed cost systems, like when you think about our delivery system and you think about our distribution system, they're largely fixed cost systems, right? You install the infrastructure and it's there. Now, incrementally as load grows, we add more infrastructure, but in these fixed cost systems, one of the outcomes of pricing is that if your load factor or utilization at a site is low, then the cost burden for that low utilization starts to become really high. And part of why we think about demand charges in this out-of-the-box manner, as we think about, well, what do we want to do for pricing to transition this industry, is that reason, is we are hoping that as time progresses and there's no adoption, utilization, and as you know, fleets themselves become more intelligent about operating in this new world, utilization improves, and by default, the utility's default rate structures will now work for this particular segment as well.
So Ruben used the GRC, and that stands for the general rate case. And so each of the IOUs submit a general rate case to the CPUC, and then the CPUC works through this process, and it can be up to a 2-year process on setting rates. That's a very basic general overview on that. And so the important thing to know is that to supply a resource like let's say water, right? Your water utility needs to look at what they need to do to supply the water to everybody, and then you have equity issues to make sure everybody has water. And so that's something similar that the electric utilities look at. And so that load utilization that Ruben was talking about, you kind of get a break right now with these EV rates, and they want to increase the utilization, and they do amazing models, and I can't believe you know, these are great minds, the folks who put together the rates. And so they're able to take all this in and kind of say, okay, if we track these factors, then it'll pay off and it'll level out, like Ruben was talking about. I'm sorry, Matt.
Actually, I'm going to jump in and see whether
go ahead.
What I understood from Matt's questions, like when are these rates available when they are after they're being approved, correct?
Yeah, I guess the question is, you know, relative to, you know, the Charge Ready program, at least if I look at individual utilities, it's a 10-year contract. If I'm a site operator, because I'd like to move away from fleets specifically, because you're using that as a catch-all term. And as was referenced earlier by Eddie from BNSF, fleets, small fleets, and we can define those varying depending on which vocation they're in drayage, primarily, no matter how large your fleet is, especially in local near port operations, you don't own your land. You're leasing it, and it's coming from a commercial real estate provider. So, you know, whoever this service provider is, if they enter into a contract and there's this concept of subsidized rates, or at least no demand charges, you've used the term 10 years, or not you specifically, Masood, but I think I've heard from a couple of the other providers so far, you know, that we have we'll look at the stated demand charges in year 10. I'm wondering when year 1 is, when that clock starts, understanding the amazing minds that going into setting rates, I can appreciate that. But if I'm representing fleet operators who are now in contracts with landlords who potentially might become service providers, what they can expect from a rate perspective, at least from a subsidy standpoint, per rate. So, you know, the clock starts here, there's a holiday. When does the holiday end, I guess, is the general.
So all of these rates, as far as, you know, at least the ones that I've been involved in, that's pretty much all the EV rates that we have now. A big emphasis is on education and marketing of the rates, and the burden is put on the IOUs to put this out, educate customers, tell them what this rate is, how it changes. So that's part of it. If you say that when it starts, again, once we approve a rate, usually depends on, it all depends, it's rate by rate, but it could be anytime like 3 months after the approval, or it could be the year after. At this point, I know that all 3 IOUs have EV rates that are in place, and you can check with the utility. I think if people are from each of the utilities, they can jump in and tell what it is. I think Ruben already talked about SCEs, but those are all going to be part of the tariffs that you're going to be signing up to.
So Matt, for SCE, service territory, the clock started in 2019. And so 10 years out was the expectation of when we would transition to normal demand charges. And in our most recent general rate case, we've asked for that 2-year extension. So originally we were going to go 2019 through 2025, but now we're saying, well, maybe we go to 2027 with this relief, demand charge relief, and then transition on a linear basis 5 years out. So we've asked for that 2-year extension. At least it'll give you a ballpark estimate of what that 10 years means for SCE's EV rates.
And for San Diego, I can say that it was the EVHB rate was approved in 2021. And that's also a 10-year rates that the subscription and rate stays the same for 3 years. And after that starts increasing. But what I want to emphasize is, like, we are coming up with these rates. We started as a policy. We wanted to start with these boutique rates and help our electrification goals, but more and more rates are coming. So I don't think that the message should be we have these rates for 10 years and after these 10 years, these rates will go away. We are going to have a variety of rates, mostly on real-time pricing coming up, both for EVs. We're actually trying to do rates that are generic for all the, whoever wants to use it. It's not going to be technology specific. So it's going to be more rates that are available across the board for a variety of options.
Okay, I can appreciate that. And not to belabor it any further, but Masood, you did mention, marketing by the IOUs, and if the IOUs and perhaps this group, ARB and CEC as well, looking at reaching out to commercial real estate providers, because, we have members who run into questions from their landlords, essentially, where there's a tremendous amount of resistance to start tearing out the parking lot and install charging infrastructure. So I think that it'd be helpful for the Watson Lands of the world to be engaged into these type of discussions to at least help them understand where they can fit in as potential service providers and partners with fleets. And then just one last question for Yamin, and I was going to ask this in the chat. Yamin, perhaps I missed this, but you mentioned there's a fee to do some type of site walk for fleets to come out to determine assessment. I'm happy to chat with that offline, but if you can maybe let me know that would be helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Let's open up the mic from Pamela from EDC, and then we'll look at addressing some from the chat. Pamela.
Hi, it's Pamela McDougall from the Environmental Defense Fund, so EDF. Actually, I just wanted to follow up a bit on Masood and maybe the utilities with regards to ME&O. I'm really impressed with the thought process and the amount of different rate options that are available to help fleets transition. I have a lot of concerns for some of the smaller fleets or some of the fleets that are completely new to electrification. And maybe this is something that the ARB is looking at as well, but are we looking at targeted ME&O to help bring these fleets along and educate them on various rate programs, in particular time variant rates? And another follow-up question I have, which is really talking about these time variant rates. Some of the fleets that we're working with have really limited operation cycles, so they have very minimal charge windows, which means they can't respond to price signals by themselves with existing charging infrastructure. And I know that we really want to look at maximizing the grid infrastructure we have and avoiding expensive grid build-outs. So I'm wondering, with these new really great time variant rates that we're offering, are we looking at maybe subsidizing technologies like on-site battery, electric storage, and solar to take it so that these EV depots can take advantage of some of these rate programs and offer beneficial electrification? Thank you.
Masood, would you like to take that? And I know that we have Dinah also from San Diego Gas and Electric on there.
I'm not sure if I was actually thinking, it's like, was there a question there, or if you understand that the limitation on small fleets for not being able to respond to price? But I missed the question in that.
So the first question was actually not for you, it's mainly for the utilities, about getting an understanding of what marketing, education, and outreach they're doing to target small fleets, to educate them on rates and the benefits of like managed charging and time variant rates, because they are completely new to the electricity sector. The second one is actually looking at how we can help fleets that have very constrained operation cycles, that aren't able to respond to a price signal with just their charging infrastructure alone because they have maybe a 4-hour time window to charge and that's it. Are we considering potentially subsidizing on-site solar and storage, for example, so they can respond, so we can mitigate grid build out to complement rate design?
Masood, did you want to handle the second question, and then perhaps we could have Dean from PG&E talk a bit more about them?
I don't think I can comment whether we're going to subsidize rates for, as I said, most, what we're trying to do at, our goals, and again, this is very detailed out in our policies, that our goal is to have variety of rates that works for everybody. If the real-time pricing, as I said, this is the next thing that we think that it's something that is good for people who are who can shift their loads and they can respond to that price. If they're not, again, they're rates with high demand charges that would be a better option for people who do not have this flexibility. And again, we are moving away from having a specific rates for a specific technology. I think the grid is just integrated now, and we having variety of rates so people can take advantage of what works for them is a better option than having these boutique rates. The boutique rates that we've been directing IOUs to offer was mainly to get a head start on this electrification, specifically for transportation electrification. Chintia, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I'm not familiar with the distribution upgrade deferral process. I think that may be where the question is touching on with regards to investments in resources that may complement a customer's or benefit a customer who's not as able to. But I mean, yeah, I'm not entirely sure where that might come into play. Perhaps if there's someone from the IOUs that knows about the distribution deferral process and whether there's evaluations of subsidizing technologies that would be customer cited, they might be able to answer that. But I think, I think as the PUC, we sort of have to balance a variety of interests here, and it's always a balance. You have to figure out what is fair for sort of everyone involved, and trying to be as agnostic as possible while still meeting the state goals is always a tricky balance.
Eric, I see from SMUD, I see your hand up. Did you want to talk about that first part of Pamela from EDF's question about reaching out to those small fleets, about
hey, Catherine, Napalo had his hand up, and he's also with a utility. And I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah, he just didn't identify himself.
Are you hearing me okay? Yeah.
Yes, we're hearing you. Can you please announce where you're from? In
Napalo?
Yeah. Welcome.
Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E.
Apologies, great.
Folks. Yeah, I had a commitment. I came in a little after 10 o'clock, so I think I snuck in, and the screens are kind of bouncing all over the place on me. I don't know if my firewall is liking this, but I had a few comments, but they were there was a lot of different things going on, so I didn't want to interrupt the flow. But I wanted to respond to the gentleman. I believe that was Hartford Trucking, and I apologize because it's hard to keep track of all the screen movement here. But from a PG&E perspective, we're doing a lot of outreach to fleets, both through our fleet program as well as through our account management teams. I think your point is very well taken and very appropriate with respect to how existing operators, they might not own the land, right? And so they're entering into some type of lease agreement, whether that's a 5, 10, 15, 20-year type of agreement, I think is really dependent upon the market. I have a dedicated team that's already working with the larger deployers of electric vehicle charging infrastructure. In all of those arrangements, they're building infrastructure on somebody else's property, right? So they're doing this through a lease agreement. We work with them. The business EV rate is very, very attractive from a financial standpoint. And there's lots of information on the web. I mean, we're happy to consult, with customers or in small group settings around this topic. I think also, just to answer your point, is the eligibility of that rate, right, is once the service is established, right, and load is being served, customers eligible for that rate. And then I think if Masood, I apologize if I mispronounced your name, he mentioned that, I think directionally, right, that there's lots of focus on having the appropriate rates that are going to encourage vehicle electrification. And I think from a PG&E standpoint, we're really excited and really engaged on what are new and innovative ways to unlock that market potential and really send the right economic signal to fleet operators to make those longer term investments. I think you might find useful, and if you want, I can give you my email. We can connect after this. There's a fleet calculator that was developed. That's like a web tool. I think that's really helpful to kind of drill into specifics. And like I said, I've got a team. We're doing lots of work already, lots of proactive consulting as well, to an extent, right? There is a need to bring in other engineering expertise at a point, but we're trying to give as much information, into the market as customers are exploring, this new market, right, of fleet electrification and more reliance upon electrons, right, to move people, places, and things. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that, Napalo. And I wanted to let you guys know, after the meeting, we will go ahead and send out to our participants the different links to the utilities programs. And on there, many of the utilities have that fleet calculator that some of the folks talked about, and they can work and work with you, just echoing, lifting up what Napalo was saying and the utilities. This has been a really great and exciting topic. And in a sense of time, we're going to need to move on now. And thankfully, we are going to do a 5-minute break. So if you could be back at 10:46, that would be great. So please, everyone, give yourself a little break, and we'll continue with the discussion. And we have some great questions that we'll go ahead and lift up when we come back. See you soon. So once again, we'll see you at 10:46.
here. Don't come downstairs, man, walk.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We'll get started here. We've had a really great conversation so far with our two established topic areas. We're going to move now to more of an open conversation. So if there are, we have a set of questions to sort of spark conversation, and Leslie's going to get us started there. But really, this is our open Q&A. Leslie, you want to?
Yeah, thank you. I was, as usual, scrambling here in that 5-minute break. And so what I'm going to do right now is share my screen. Let's see. And we did include a list of questions in the agenda that we posted earlier. And based on the conversation, can everybody see my screen? Oh, here, let me say share. Okay, can everybody see the screen? So I've reorganized the questions a little bit, kind of to reflect the flow of the discussion. And so I think this very first question I have highlighted, let me enlarge this a little bit, but I would like to touch on, because I do think it's important in that it works to look at strategies that can happen both at the fleet side and the utility side to try to, how do we solve this problem and how can we make the most efficient use of the energy that's being delivered to the site and to support our growing fleet. So you'll see the first question is, what role does distributed energy resources, net energy metering, advanced load management, and energy storage play in the transportation electrification? And what actions are being encouraged to include these types of strategies? Bonnie had her, I'd really like for Bonnie Data to kind of share your thoughts and opinions on this. And first, introduce yourself first. And I will take the screen share down. So Bonnie, if you can unmute your mic.
Yep. Can you hear me, Leslie?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to comment on this. Been waiting for a while. So I actually want to also comment on Ava's question about how do we ensure competitive marketplace, as well as Pamela McDougall from EDF, who's doing some very good work in the role of distributed energy resources in fleet electrification. But coming back to your question, given the kind of technology innovation that we are witnessing in this space, we've been actively encouraging the regulatory agencies in California and outside to update how it currently views what constitutes charging infrastructure, quote unquote. And this update entails broadening the infrastructure components beyond what we've called the traditional utility make-ready, front of the meter and charger stroke EVSC network software behind the meter to include distributed energy resources, both as non-wires alternative in front of the meter, as well as advanced load technologies behind the meter. These technologies are inherently part of charging infrastructure, very broadly defined, and they are critical in driving cost efficiency by reducing and eliminating unnecessary distribution system upgrades, front of the meter, and then the service interconnection inefficiencies that we are seeing on both the customer side and utility side of the meter. So in terms of talking about distributed energy resources, we're finding often in our customers, fleet customers, that it's not about what the supply is. If you just look at CAISO's March 8 or the latest curtailment figures, you will see something like over 400,000 megawatt hours have been curtailed. So it's not the supply issue. If you just take that, extrapolate that, that's going to charge something like over 600,000 electric vehicles. So supply of electricity is not the issue, but supply of power to the site is an issue. And we need to ensure from a regulatory perspective, so this is a kind of request to the regulatory agencies, be that CEC and especially CPUC, that as you are looking to incentivize, utilities to provide make-ready, there are alternatives available that does not require these traditional upgrades. Why aren't we looking at distributed energy resources as instead of the traditional upgrades? We've seen that happen in New York. It's a very well-established case study in terms of how DERs can negate the requirement for system upgrade. And then behind the meter, it is critical that we provide the incentive for customers to cite DERs so that they're able to manage their operating expenses, the energy costs as part of operating expenses. And Pamela raised this very valid question: what are we doing to incentivize that? Because right now, in face of, I'm a huge supporter of dynamic prices, but customers should also have the ability to manage their energy costs through advanced load technologies, management technologies that are currently available. With that, I will stop and be open to questions and comments going forward.
Yeah, at this point, because I think, Bonnie, you bring up.
Leslie, you're muted.
Thank you. Bonnie brings up some really good questions, and I was hoping if we have an agency or a utility partner that's able to speak to the advanced load management, distributed energy, all of the things that Bonnie was bringing up. If you could raise your hand. Michael, thank you.
Yeah, so the CPC has been taking efforts to see more incorporation of DERs and the advanced load management options within the utilities transportation electrification plans. In December 2021, the CPUC directed the utilities to consider, or yeah, December 2020, I'm sorry, the CPUC directed the utilities to consider customer-side ALM options for all customers installing EV charging infrastructure via a specific utility side TE charging program or through a rule and tariff. This decision was approved to implement the VGI strategies directed or pursued through the SB 676 legislation. And it stated that the utilization of ALM technology is important to ensure that the utility and customer side of the meter investments necessary to support EV charging are performed at a lower cost to ratepayers than would otherwise need it to be without ALM. We're still trying to work through the process of how this should be, implemented and enforced. Most of the time, let me take another step back. The EV infrastructure rules that the utilities will begin offering later this year, they need to educate customers about the options of installing customer side ALM. But the barrier that we're seeing right now is the customer side ALM is, it's within its name, it's on the customer side of the meter, and utilities responsibility is very strictly on the utility end when implementing or installing the infrastructure through these rules. So the most we can do, essentially, well, not the most we can do, I don't want to box yourself in a corner, but as the policies are written now, it's very educational based, explaining the benefits to the customer of installing ALM, how the load itself, or the ease of using the charging infrastructure and ensuring the charge through your vehicle is receiving the appropriate charge that you need to perform your operations at a lower lower voltage or a lower output from the charger. How that's beneficial to them, and they don't really need to have the full highest level of charging that most customers who don't really know are too much aware of EV charging assume they actually need it. Their charging needs to what you actually need to perform your charging, your operations. In addition to this, we do have some additional efforts where we're trying to incorporate EV charging within all DER programs too. Within the EV infrastructure rules that were approved back last year, as I already mentioned, we're directing the utilities to actually start examining how, when they're building this infrastructure to support EV charging, how they can ensure that they are supporting not just the state's EV goals, but all energy and climate goals. So they need to start looking more at how they can size the location, they can size a transformer to actually support future building electrification, and talk to the customers about how they can install on-site generation if necessary, and what other options are available through load shifting or demand response programs that can allow them to size their site accordingly and not need to overbuild it, but also allow for enough capacity to support more electrification in the future. And the CPC is also trying to take the steps to see EVs as the grid resource that we all hope that they will be in the near future. I believe it was back in November of 2021, the CPC adopted the summer reliability decision, and I'm blanking on the decision number, but within this decision, it included EVs within the ELRP program, which, if I'm remembering correctly, is Emergency Load Reduction Program. So this means that EV owners are now eligible to provide services to the grid and receive compensational payments based on the load that they're providing the grid at certain periods of the day. So this is just a long-winded way of saying that we are taking steps to ensure that the incorporation or the holistic approach of having all of our climate energy programs being considered not just in a silo as we potentially may have been viewing them earlier, or in the last decade. We're now building a bridge to make sure that we're looking at this as a unified, strict goal that we need to achieve together instead of just, the individual. And sorry that didn't answer your question exactly, but I'm happy to follow up if
Thanks,
you'd like.
Michael. Now I'd like to, Matt Belden from SDG&E has his hand raised. So can you give us a utility perspective of this?
Hello, everybody. Matt Belden. I manage our electric distribution planning group. Great points by Michael there. I just want to reiterate a couple points for this item. And we're integrating a high number of DER at a very rapid pace, right? But with reforms for compensation or performance where we can kind of mitigate peak hours, those could definitely be better aligned with grid and transportation needs, I think. And there's a lot of efforts across various proceedings that are happening to try and highlight those possibilities. But EVs themselves, they really create a good opportunity for like demand response or load management. If you can kind of flatten the load profiles, you can enhance that grid utilization. But tariffs and kind of shaping consumer behavior, are very important for that effort.
Thank you, Matt. And I am aware, I can't cite them all, but I have been getting a lot of news feeds lately of pilot projects associated with vehicle to grid
Yes,
getting explored
absolutely.
and underway. And that's the first step, is to have, automotive pilots as well as school bus pilots, which have also been underway. So
yes, if I may, just one more quick point that I wanted to add, because I think there was also a question about how DERs can potentially defer kind of traditional wires projects. And I think folks should really reference a lot of the effort in the DRP, which is a previous proceeding. A lot of this is now rolled into track 1 of the high DER proceeding. But there has been a very large effort within California. I know New York was referenced. I'm not as familiar with what has taken place there, but there's what's called the DITIF framework, which is the distribution deferral framework. This is an entire framework that exists to potentially defer traditional wires projects. So I would take a look at that. There's been a lot of effort. There's a screening process. A DER has to be cost effective, and there's a timing screen, which are two very big obstacles for DERs. So I would tune into that, and you can see some of the success or how that's played out in that process.
Thanks, Matt. And this is a request for Matt and Michael and perhaps others. The proceedings that you mentioned, to many of us, it's just a bunch of letters and numbers. But if there is a link that you can put in the chat to, just let people know if they're interested in finding out more about these proceedings, where they need to go. And I'm going to let Kevin have the floor right now.
Hey,
Oh,
Leslie,
Brandon.
just what he was saying, let me try to interpret that for everybody. The deferral framework, so we put in, solar and storage at your site. Well, that means you don't have to upgrade transmission, right? And so how does the utility value that? And how does that run through all of their rate structures? And that's when he starts talking about this deferral process and then all the PUC acronyms. So maybe that helps just a little bit. Okay, thanks.
Oh, our acronym whisperer. Thank you, Brandon.
Yeah. Go ahead,
Kevin.
Sorry.
Thanks. Kevin Hamilton with Central California Asthma Collaborative. And I heard an acronym ALM earlier. I didn't know what that one was either. Can you whisper that one for me?
Advanced load management. Oh, sorry.
Advanced load management. Oh, that
Thanks.
makes sense. So with regard to this topic, which I think is the critical topic, and a project we're part of that illustrates that is the Watt EV all-electric truck stop down in Kern that broke ground, 2 months ago, and will eventually now has its own solar field generating 6 megawatts, but will be opening other solar fields with a goal of eventually generating, I think it's 12 gigawatts. a lot of power, ridiculous amount of power. But so I just wondered, how the utilities are supporting that kind of approach, and I think that's the critical feature for the future that we are needing here. I spent 2 hours this morning listening to, or more, sort of the utilities discussing, and CPUC how they would regulate sort of what I consider business as usual modifications to manage the grid demand that these vehicles will bring. But yet, I'll be honest with you, I didn't feel like I was hearing a lot of out of the box thinking. It's more within the box. How can we, manage to sort of move things around, and in some cases adjust this knob here and up and this one down, and still with this idea of putting wires in the ground or in the air and getting them to certain spots with certain levels of power, versus and there's a limitation to that, right? And an extreme cost. There's a rate explosion at this point. I lose track and have lost track of the number of rate cases, for instance, that PG&E is running at any given moment. Rate payers are screaming both on the business side, as a business owner, I can tell you, and residents. And so, there's a point here where the impact on business is so great that I think it actually restricts business from functioning. We've certainly seen examples of that where I am here in the San Joaquin in agriculture, but more specifically, this idea of DER power on site for these big facilities where they have a lot of roof space as well, with battery backups. I mean, this would seem just common sense to me when you look across on one of the interstates like the 215, or coming in through Long Beach or in southern Kern County, right in South Fresno or up in Stockton. Any of these big areas where you've got literally square miles of freight facility, distribution centers, warehouses, empty rooftops. It would seem that the investment there is natural. The question is who makes that investment? And I would think it would be in the utility's best interest to buffer up their reserve by doing more than just providing information, but figuring out how to partially at least fund those operations, because they're going to gain the benefit of that, and they're going to need that power to keep that grid up on peak hours. And then the last thing I want to mention, and I'm really curious about, is the consideration of using the microgrid technology again in these areas where there's quite a number of these facilities that are purpose built for these vehicles, and often these vehicles yards are in these same locations. Why, again, I think the utilities could be on the forefront of working with local cities and counties to facilitate the installation of these at the construction phase, and then for the existing facilities as add-ons. Sorry, allergies are going crazy down here in the San Joaquin. To again distribute power to areas where it's most needed at that time. You notice in these various facilities that depending on the products they're moving and their storage needs types, whether it's refrigeration or just dry storage, or in place for long periods of time or short, that there are a lot of variations in use within these spaces. And so this kind of technology is prime for that, but on a grand scale, not 4 or 5 buildings, and regardless of who owns them. So at some point in time, it would seem to me that the regulatory agencies in the state could provide some leadership here from the policy side, and again, the funding side, to incentivize the folks who own these big spaces, more the landlords, I suppose, to go ahead and make these kinds of renovations that would help us out a lot in the future.
Thank you, Kevin. I think you bring up some, you know, and I'm sort of in the same court as you are, not knowing, you know, just learning as how all of this works. And I look at the big picture and I think, wow, this seems to be such a no-brainer. But I do understand that for especially an investor-owned utility to be able to do pretty much anything, there typically has to be a proceeding that occurs first that allows them to take such actions, and then things start moving. So that's an extremely layman terms, which is, I am basically setting an example, because I'm hoping that perhaps someone at PUC could first really give a very layman's, you know, maybe 8th grade education description of
Could
what
I just
might
mention, let me just mention one more thing, because what comes up in this is also funding. And I mentioned the utilities, but I forgot to mention that in these air basins where the local air districts and CARB are in violation of various standards, the EPA has a significant funding stream called an airshed grant. And I happen to know that some of these entities, some of these folks building these facilities are able to work with air districts and take advantage of that money in order to fund them to reduce PM 2.5 by adding these electrified trucking. So it's really important to kind of put all the pieces together. I don't want to load it all on just the utilities. Yeah, how do we pay for these things is a critical conversation to have. So
thank you for putting icing on the cake there. So I guess I'm going to tee up the response. I would like for someone, you know, to give us, you know, like I say, a maybe 6th to 8th grade level description of what the PUC is doing to help enable what Kevin's talking about, integration of, you know, microgrids, energy storage, you know, energy metering, all of that to allow for the utilities to then integrate these strategies into their various utility territories based on the unique conditions of those territories. So perhaps after that, we can have Napalo speak to that. And then I could probably talk to the funding piece, but I want to more like listen in on that and hear what we can do on CARB's end, because we do have money through AB 617 that would serve this purpose specifically, because that's targeted in the most deserving, that funding is targeted for the most deserving areas, and these types of solutions fall in the realm of the funding that we have through AB 617. So is that going to be Michael or Masood that gives us the high level, how it works at your level first?
Yeah, I can jump in. You know, on our end, you know, it really depends on a proceeding being open to incorporate all these, or to review the resources.
Michael, your audio is horrible. You cut in and out. Yeah.
Is this better?
That's a little better, yeah. It just kind of gets garbled sometimes, that's all.
Please let me know if not, and I can try to call in if it continues this way. So what was I saying? So we do have, we need to have an open proceeding to actually look at like how we can align all the technologies together to ensure that we can incorporate distributed energy resources within the planning for TE infrastructure. You know, as you know, outside of these proceedings, I think as the CEC mentioned in their introduction, you know, we're looking at these demand case scenarios and looking at how the utilities should be building out the infrastructure to, you know, both the distribution and the generation end to support the expected EV load, and, you know, beyond that, the load from building decarbonation that we are trying to encourage. So within these forecasts, we're able to, you know, get a good understanding of what infrastructure and what investments need to be made to support either the generation end or the capacity side of what the local customers' needs are. So, I mean, while it's not a very specific, you know, customer level effort that we're leading, we are looking at it as a system-wide effort, and the utilities are able to take this information to go to the individual customer to actually, you know, focus on the specific needs of that site itself. And I don't know if utility wants to talk about what they do when they're communicating with the customer about what their long-term planning strategies and infrastructure develop or rollout actually are. But this is something that the utilities have that customer to utility relationship that we at the CPUC don't have. We are just able to listen to the customers and consider that feedback during the proceeding to determine what we actually tell the utilities to do.
Got it, Michael. Thank you.
So
that's what I needed. Napalo, could you speak to that from PG&E's perspective?
Yeah, is my sound coming in? I'm good. Okay, thanks. I will just disclaimer. I'll dance a little bit around the procurement side and policy side because that's not my wheelhouse. I'm more on the front lines of building projects. So I wanted to respond to Kevin, to a couple of Kevin's comments, and then maybe I could also just respond to the recent dialogue. So I think one of the things, and I'm just going to speak to generalities that I'm seeing in the market, I will not name a specific customer project, right? But when we look at the reality of distributed energy resources, right, and putting those on site where you're going to have a significant fleet charging load, one of the interesting aspects of all of this, right, is that there are firms out there selling that as a solution, right? And the economic incentives are already there, the pieces are there. However, when you get into these higher generation capacities, right, and you're talking about many megawatt thresholds, often if you want to interconnect to the existing grid, that's going to be at a higher voltage, and I think that's one of the inherent challenges. Interconnection into the transmission system under the existing Electric Rule 21. That's just it's a complicated infrastructure project, right? If that is the path that a customer is pursuing, I think there's a lot of potential. For microgrid projects. We have a very recent tariff. Now, this was stood up more in response to wildfire risk and our public safety power, shut off program, and we have a community microgrid enablement program that is made to help communities, enable microgrids. There may be opportunity. And I'm speaking conceptually. I'm not involved in any particular program development right now, but there may be opportunity, I think, for further discussion around, well, should we be looking at fleet microgrids, right? And well, what does that really entail? And what's innovative program design? And how do we really make it happen to leverage the positive economic indicators that are already there, that are incenting certain technologies to be deployed, and how do we make it safe on the grid, right? How do we get everything working so that we're providing that economic benefit and that environmental benefit in the respective communities, right? Because I think we all can agree that clean air is a benefit that that we want to see regardless of where we actually rest our head at night, right? So I think it's definitely a discussion that we need to continue having. Maybe I'll just stop there because I can keep going and see if there's any responses.
I think Bonnie had some follow-up questions.
Thank you, Leslie. It's more about a comment to what Michael from the PUC said, as well as kind of share some additional background on why we need DERs, especially in California. So Michael, thank you very much for raising the aspect that we've operated in siloed mode, and one can argue we are still operating in siloed mode in as far as proceedings are concerned at the PUC. It was very exciting when the high DER came on, was announced, and we thought, well, this is going to be one where we will cover, EV charging infrastructure co-sited with DERs, but again, even that's kind of to some extent siloed. So I think the challenge to the PUC and you know, again to you, Leslie, and team, as you all are coordinating this, is how do we streamline the process so that we don't have to jump through the DDRF process that has been, you know, plagued with lots of issues, as we all know. How do we streamline the process so that a customer who is looking to deploy behind the meter DERs at a fleet site can do so without all the hoops and the bureaucracy that we currently have to run through? So this is a challenge to the PUC and to the other regulatory bodies. And then I like to say, you know, Napalo raised that, you know, it's a great thing that we should be deploying DER. PG&E themselves have submitted to the PUC that they have had savings of between $30,000 to $200,000 per project within its EV charge network program by using behind the meter ALMs in over 20 sites. So we already know that what the benefits are for co-siting DERs with EV charging infrastructure. It's about streamlining the process. And so this is really my kind of challenge to the regulatory bodies here. And then one last point. Again, I don't want to belabor the point, but it should be noted that Electrify America has installed energy storage at 140 DCFC sites across the US, including more than 90 in California. And one of the reasons they do so is the resiliency aspect. And I keep telling anybody that would listen to me that there is no point in having EV chargers that do not have the power to charge. So having the resiliency aspect within charging infrastructure, especially for fleets which have duty cycle bound charging requirements, is absolutely critical, and we cannot overstate this. So as you are thinking about charging infrastructure, it's almost that you have to think about resiliency, which is why behind the meter DERs become absolutely critical, especially for fleet infrastructure. Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate you giving me the time.
Thank you, Bonnie. Sarah?
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to leave my video off so my audio doesn't get interrupted. I see that's been happening. But my name is Sarah Delorier. I represent the California Association of Sanitation Agencies. I'm just going to be building on some of the top, I guess, comments that have been made and even questions. Just for folks to understand the organization or the members, we do represent folks that are the municipal wastewater treatment agencies of California. About over 90% of the Seward flow is the makeup of our membership. And of course, we treat wastewater to protect public health and the environment as our objective. And we also recover resources to ultimately support community resilience. But we are an essential public service provider, so we are working to maintain our services under all conditions, whether there be a natural disaster or some power safety or the public supply power shutoffs. And so we're coming here today to share some thoughts on what you had mentioned just earlier in terms of looking at distributed energy resources, as well as looking at dampening that peak demand, because as you know, water and wastewater is one of the larger energy consumers of the state, right? And so we're looking at different operational changes to dampen that peak demand during the day and to help manage the load a little bit better. And a couple of ways that we're looking at that is actively looking at, use of reservoirs upstream for water storage and shifting pumping schedules to avoid that peak demand. We're also looking at, more on the wastewater side, increasing the use of co-digestion to produce additional biogas, in turn energy or fuel that can allow alternatives to grid demand. So in that context, I did want to get a little bit more into how we can produce that additional biogas and how that plays into this electrification of vehicles. Of course, we do fully support carbon neutrality. And part of that is multiple programs. One is Senate Bill 1383, where we're trying to divert organic waste, and the major components or pathways to do that are compost and anaerobic digestion. But there are not enough emission reduction credits in the state to permit compost facilities. And when you're getting into the details, we're getting into the details to try to figure out how we can help reduce the methane. And what we're seeing is that looks at then anaerobic digestion. There are other options, but anaerobic digestion is one of the major, I guess, opportunities available. And the State Water Board actually did a co-digestion capacity analysis study that showed, oh, our municipal wastewater anaerobic digesters have enough capacity to take food waste. And we can take that food waste, co-digest it, and produce a renewable biogas that then can be used for on-site energy production, which most of us have on-site energy production as a resilience measure because we are an essential public service. So if ever there's a grid outage, we can keep going with that. But there's not enough emission reduction credits then to take the additional biogas generated from food waste. So we can't combust more. So we're looking at other uses like fuel, transportation fuel. And that's shown as one of the major highest and best uses of that biogas. Members have looked at, though, in the meantime, electric vehicles, because of this new regulation and looking at how can we now do this for Senate Bill 1383 while looking at electric vehicles, but they're not available for the medium and heavy duty in the timeline. So that gets back to timeline issue that we're looking at, and we've talked to different manufacturers about the specific vehicles we need to maintain our essential public service. For example, vacuum and jetter trucks. And we really have to keep our services going. And those are then used for critical response too. So we're looking at when the timeline is for that. In the meantime, we do have folks that have already invested in near zero emission vehicles because they're immediately available. And then it's a resilient measure. We like to have more than one option, electric and others, so we can always maintain our services. But even if ZEVs were ready, like right now, the limited battery life, the distance, terrain limitations, lack of recharging, and on-road weight restrictions for these vehicles are inhibiting our members to do those operations they need right now. So in the meantime, we want to talk about the near zero emission vehicle definition, and allowing for the use of biogas as a CNG vehicle fuel, because it does accomplish those NOx emissions reductions and the PM reductions that Kevin was mentioning, that we need to also be in compliance with local and Clean Air Act requirements for ozone non-attainment.
Hey, Sarah, yes. I appreciate your input on all of this. It is a little off topic.
Yeah, well, we wanted to talk about the integration and the coordination.
Yeah, no, but I did want to pose a question to you. Are you aware of and following the really proactive things going on in Southern California gas territory, SoCal Gas?
We are, and we're working with folks.
A ton of potential. So yeah.
Well, there is, and then there's limitations, right, with the air districts. So we really want folks to coordinate with air districts, CEC, CPUC, Air Resources Board, and CalRecycle, because we're seeing that there's unintended conflicts with these regulations.
So perhaps you could reach out to me on the side.
Yeah,
that would be great.
Absolutely, absolutely. We just really want to coordinate.
You're speaking to a subject near and dear to my heart. So
excellent.
I do want to move on to the next question on the queue, if possible. I'm going to share my screen again. So this is coming up a lot in the discussions, and it's kind of going back to the big picture. How are the utilities quantifying the future transportation electrification demands in the next 5, 10, 15 years? I know we've talked about that. I totally appreciate Michael's and Kyle's and Micah's description of how much more granular these models are getting, but maybe a little bit more reassurance to help us all understand how what you're doing to make sure those demands are being met, especially in those heavy urban areas that are already built out fairly well, but perhaps insufficient for increased demand. And then especially the ports that are going to have a much greater electrification requirements. So I'm just curious. So that's the next question in the queue, and I'm absolutely going to reserve and cut people off for my very last question. So just look at it right now. We're not leaving this one off the table. So I see a couple of hands. Matt, I would unshare my screen and let Matt have the floor on this one.
Thanks, Leslie. So this is a really good question. I just want to maybe cue up a little context for folks that are unaware. And right, I think folks like LA, DWP, or SMUD might have different perspectives, but generally for the regulated IOUs, right, and I'll only speak for SDG&E on this. Our distribution planning process is it's an outline process that we coordinate. And it utilizes the CEC forecast, right? So there are scenarios within the CEC forecast that have components such as energy efficiency, PV, and more relevant for today's conversation, transportation electrification component. So one of the keys for us to be successful, and there's a lot happening, like I said, in that track one of the high DER proceeding in completing this, is these components need to reflect state policy. And, you know, I think there needs to be some work there. And I know that that's happening. I think there's a new CEC forecast coming out as soon as a couple months that might be more reflective or a sensitivity study. But generally that's how the IOUs forecast, right? So we utilize that, we leverage what is within that CEC forecast and specifically the IPER. And we disaggregate that across our territory to account for transportation electrification. So big effort there needs to be to ensure that that is accurate, those components that we're using. But outside of that, other ways and strategies that we've taken is we really have to interact directly with the customers until we have maybe more accuracy in what's being forecasted. So the port is a great example. We've taken extra efforts to meet with the port, ensure we have plans in place to provide service for all of the various projects, upgrades that are happening in the port area. So customer advocacy is crucial to be successful to plan for these specific load pockets. Like I said, this distribution planning process for the IOUs, it's a very established process. There is a 10-year general window that we're planning for, but maybe that does need to increase to 15 or 20 years, right? To start looking at some of this. And what we want to be sure, at least SDG&E, once we start to see this transportation electrification component start to be more reflective of what is within the state policy, we think there needs to be a focus on ensuring those long lead type of items. So transmission upgrades, substation upgrades. These are components that we can build. They generally take, you know, upwards of 7 to 10 years to build. They're very large projects to build. Those should be the focus on what we can build in that, you know, 10+ year window, 10, 20 years. When we start getting into the conversation of the first 5 years, at least SDG&E, we feel like we've been very successful in meeting our customer needs and building infrastructure in a 1 to 2 year window. So we feel like we're in good shape. We definitely don't want to build distribution that might not be forecasted to be needed for 10 plus 15, 20 years, because distribution is so granular. If I build transmission or I build substation, I know that generally this load pocket I'm gonna be able to serve, and I can build the distribution as it materializes over time. But that's why it's key. All of those components, the CEC forecast has to be reflective of state policy, and then we can generally align a strategy better to ensure we have the infrastructure in place.
Thank you so much. I do want to hear from another utility, but at the same time, because we're kind of moving close to the end, and I think these two questions kind of go hand in hand. What are we doing to plan for the next 5, 10 years? How are we making sure we get all of that information? But that question does go to the next one. How do we make sure, or what is the best way for fleets to deliver that transportation electrification information over to the utilities? What is the best way to get those plans to the utilities? So as we're talking about both of these things, I'm teeing up this question because I'm really hoping I see some hands raised from our fleet partners that I know are in the audience. So, but first, since Apollo had his hand raised, and then I will go to Aravind next. Thanks.
Yeah, you hear me okay? Just want to double check the sound. Did you want me to answer that question about how to engage with the utilities or how the fleet, or was that, I misunderstood what, oh, Leslie, you're muted.
Start with the quantification, long-term demand piece, but at the same time, if that also you can able to integrate that communication.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep my comments brief because I think Matt, SDG&E, I believe, right? I think he had some comments that are pretty in line with how PG&E is thinking about this problem set. I wanted to frame up kind of a broader thinking is the opportunity. I think the opportunity between the various state agencies and our local government structures, right? Thinking from a Bay Area context, because that's where I reside, Association of Bay Area Governments, and I'm just calling that out just as kind of a body that is representative of kind of the greater consortium of cities and counties and so forth. When we look at all of the electrification ordinances that you see coming in, so this gets broader into the subject of building electrification as well as transportation electrification, and you start looking at this, okay, how do we do all of this? You have to look at the existing infrastructure base, and then we have to say, okay, we have plans already to do X, Y, and Z in various cities, right? Whether we're getting into transmission, substation, infrastructure, which often we are, but there is an inherent challenge in the ability to really efficiently get that work done. And so I think this is truly I'd say just it's an opportunity and a challenge in front of us, right? Is around this broader goals of electrification and how we move everything in concert. So I want to frame that up. I think that merits a lot more discussion, especially in the years ahead here. I think that's yes, most definitely. And then I would just say with respect to engaging with fleets, I mean, like I said, PG&E, we have dedicated teams. There's a lot of web resources. Maybe I should put my email in the chat. Happy to engage with folks. We've got our customer program side, our fleet program. There's a lot of activity where we are making a very, very proactive intent to engage with the market. But this is new at the same time, right? Fleet electrification. If there's certain industry bodies or representatives that we should be proactively engaging with, I think we welcome the conversation to help these respective industry groups and customers understand how we're trying to support this market growth. So
thank you so much.
I'll just stop there. Yeah.
And before I move on to Aravind, I want to put a shout out to all of you. In addition to how we collaborate, also, what does Workgroup 3.2 look like? And it just looks like Apollo just teed that up for me. That's one subject. So putting it out to all of you before we end, that if you do have ideas about what you think this next workshop should look like, please shoot me an email. I'd be happy to, of the topics that we might want to cover, because I do want to get everyone's input. Okay, Aravind, your turn.
Thank you, Leslie. And I will be following up. I meant to do that 2 weeks ago or whenever we last met. But my input for consideration of this committee, great discussion, by the way, everybody. Let's invite the fleets to the table. And we have fleets today, but what I'm specifically referring to are the fleets that are part of the GGRF, ZANZF, CARB CEC projects. The state agencies are making significant investments here, and we really want to learn what their experience, learn from their experiences, and it's going to be the ground truth. There's going to be a lot of good things we're going to hear about, but I think also interestingly, we can also have this tailored so that they can come and talk about their experiences, they can come and talk about their future plans, and we can all sort of be the audience and ask questions. And I think something like that will be very, very helpful. And CARB and CEC, you guys have made a ton of investments, and CARB especially the last several years. So I think it'll be nice to bring these guys and say, all right, let's talk about what you learned, what you're going to do, and how you're going to ramp up. So just food for thought.
Beautiful. And don't think they haven't been invited. I think a lot of them have such have bandwidth issues for sure.
We'll definitely tailor it.
Yeah.
It's got to be an hour, maybe an hour and a half. So
yeah, exactly.
I think they may not have the bandwidth to do 4 hours.
Yeah, I know who they are, but I think it's a fabulous idea, and I will that's on my list to do. Thanks, Ervin. Matt.
Hi, thanks. I can appreciate that. You know, this is Matt from the Harbor Trucking Association. It's one thing to engage the large fleets, their challenges, the bottlenecks that they've run into, cost considerations, I think is important. But, you know, when you ask about hearing from fleets about their plans, again, if we think about in our sector, specifically in drayage, which is not necessarily only owner operators, it is made up of small fleets that could be anywhere from 10 or fewer, 20 or fewer. All are generally have the same kind of constraints, namely they don't own the property that they're operating at. And I think we're assuming a lot of things, and without having the ability to compartmentalize each different fleet segment into specific discussions, I feel like we're doing a disservice to those who need this outreach the most. When you ask, well, what can fleets do? I mean, I feel like what should the ARB, the PUC, the IOUs, the CEC, what should they be doing to talk about the infrastructure availability, especially from a public facing standpoint for these fleets, if opportunity charging, right, for these fleets that don't have the ability to install infrastructure. I mean, I looked at the fleet calculators, they're assuming low carbon fuel credit capability. Not every fleet is going to have the ability to utilize low carbon fuel credits. So, I mean, this is what I think there is this major disconnect in the ability to deploy technology, charging technology. The truck is one thing, but talking to large fleets will help, but there needs to be a significant more focus on what public charging infrastructure is going to be available to those fleets who don't have the ability to come up with a plan or think that they can start their own microgrids or put solar in. Again, talk to the commercial real estate operators. Those are the people who own these buildings and these properties. Even the large fleets are in leasing scenarios a lot of the time. So, I mean, that would be my perspective about fleet outreach. The ones who are already engaged in it are large top 10 motor carriers that have nationwide operations, as well as significant capital resources to invest and to test some of these challenges. So public facing is going to be the key. Otherwise, this is not going to work.
Absolutely, Matt. And I think we all agree with you on that. One thing I can say, and I don't know if Craig Deering was able to talk about this, but there is the rollout plan for the compliance on this reg is probably going to be focusing and hitting, you know, those larger fleets first, while at the same time, we have in our Energize program, there is a focus on public charging infrastructure, public hydrogen refueling infrastructure in those funding lanes. They haven't been released yet, but a key piece of the reason for those funding lanes is to be able to refuel for fleets that do not have that home-based option. As those programs start to take shape and roll out, I think the input coming from the fleets and people such as yourself is going to be critically important. And so I always encourage you guys to be engaged in this, because nobody is going to understand what that infrastructure needs to look like better than you guys. So,
right. Well, you'd think that the ARB and the CEC
and
would understand what the infrastructure would look like. And excuse my frustration, Leslie, and also I know Craig is on the line, but There's a drayage entry standard that kicks in prior to any of the other standards specifically, and that is made up of small fleets, not just single truck owner operators, but the small 10, 20 fleet operators as well. So again, I don't, if we're lumping everyone together under the same umbrella, that it's just medium duty or heavy duty, it doesn't function. I'm sorry, it doesn't. So I think it's important to have those discussions, and we'll be engaged without a doubt, but we need to hear directly from what the state is planning to do as they mandate the use of this equipment that costs as much as a condominium in some small town somewhere, or for a house for that matter. So we need to hear from
Shoot me an
the
email,
state.
Matt. Topic for a follow-up meeting. Shoot me an email.
Yeah, it's
okay?
called public facing infrastructure availability and planning. That's the plan.
Your point is well taken, and I very much respect what you have to say. Thank you. Pamela?
Hi, Leslie. Thank you for this engaging conversation. And also thank you to Aravind and Matt. That covered a lot of what I wanted to kind of bring up, which was really, I know that the utilities are taking a lot of input from fleets that do engage with them with their transportation electrification planning. I am concerned that if it's just waiting for the fleets to come, that we're not going to be able to accurately forecast our load. So I'm curious about maybe expanding a bit on what Matt mentioned about targeted outreach to certain fleet segments, such as smaller fleets, but also bringing bigger fleets to the table to figure out when and where their bigger load is going to be brought on the grid. Are you considering having targeted outreach for them, both at the state agency level and maybe at the utility level, to learn that, include that in your load forecasting planning? And then also, how does managed charging and on-site DERs fit into that load forecast planning when you are working with these different size fleets for planning?
Does anybody want to take that one on? I'll let Lisa chime in, and if somebody has but again, Pamela, reach out to me again, because I think sometimes you guys are teeing up really good discussion points that we could dig into a little deeper in a follow-up workshop. So appreciate it very much. Lisa. Lisa, if this is Lisa McGee, I'm just assuming, we can't hear you. You have your hand raised. Okay, I see no other hands raised. Annalisa, would we like to maybe wrap it up and next steps? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. A great discussion today. I really appreciate that we've had a lot of back and forth questions and answers, comments and responses. That's what we were really hoping to achieve with this format of meeting. So thank you so much to everyone that's been on our panel and participating both as panelists and as participants through the Q&A. I wanted to summarize some of the top things that I heard, and I took some heat last time that I did this, that I didn't reiterate all of the topics that were brought up. I want to bring up some of the things that I've heard from multiple presenters, multiple participants, and sort of more on a thematic side than specifically reiterating. We're recording this, we've got folks taking notes, so we are hearing everybody's contributions. But in particular, we had a robust conversation about the role of DER, storage, ALM, and how we need to consider making that more an integral part of the infrastructure development in terms of cost, incentives, project planning. So look forward to having more conversation about that more holistic look at how infrastructure can roll out for medium and heavy duty that incorporates these additional topics. On rates, there's a lot of interest in better understanding the timeframes of available alternative rates or alternatives to demand charges, and concern about the fleets that aren't able to take advantage of time-based rate structures. Open to suggestions on what our next steps there are. Maybe it is more information to fleets about their specific utility rate structures and a way to make that more transparent and available to folks, but also open to other suggestions. And then working with utilities on long-term infrastructure planning, we heard that the utilities really want to hear from customers about what their long-term plans are and be part of that planning process from the first trucks that need infrastructure all the way to a full fleet conversion. And they're open to finding ways to incrementally make that happen in a way that is most cost-effective and efficient. And picking up on this last conversation about how to get at all fleets, we have touched on this issue a couple of times in our previous work group meetings, the idea of some kind of reporting tool for fleets to share with utilities and infrastructure providers what their plans are. You know, in the past, we would have maybe thrown something into regulation saying that the fleet has to report this, and then we would share it out. There may be a lot of considerations around whether CARB would be the right entity to collect that information when it's other agencies that would make better use of that, and ultimately utilities that need to get that information. I would like to suggest that that may be an area for a future meeting for us to really dig in on that and figure out who would be the right host, what are fleets willing to share, what is the information utilities really need, and what is their consensus around how to structure that in a way that folks can get on board with and that we could actually implement. It really nuts and bolts. Who hosts it? How is it accessed? What's the reporting rate? I mean, I could think of a dozen different aspects of that conversation. If there's support for that, I'd like to make that one of our next steps. So we are planning to summarize what we've heard across these 5 meetings. We are planning to have an informational board item for our board across all infrastructure issues, light duty, heavy duty, off-road. And part of that will be a summary of what we have been hearing from these 5 work group meetings. This is really intended to help our board understand what the infrastructure issues are and what actions the state agencies are taking to address those. It'll be a short presentation by me and presentations by our partner agencies, many of whom have been participating in this, this work group series. And then an opportunity for the board to have a discussion and for participants to comment. I'm going to be throwing this out here without having consulted my team yet, but I would like to do a post participation survey of the work group participants to see how this has been useful or not to you, what you think of the structure, and what your recommendations are for future communications and work group meetings. So with that, I want to say thank you. I know we have a great deal of brain trust present in our participants here, in the panel, in the participants who have been listening and participating through the Q&A. I really appreciate your time. I understand this is a big block of time that we're asking for. And so, you know, that may too be something that we seek feedback on. With so much to say and so much to talk about, is there a more efficient way that would work better for you in the future? And I also would like to invite, if folks want to have individual meetings with us, please reach out to me, to Leslie. We're happy to set those up. We are very much in the world of wanting to learn from folks about what's really happening on the ground and understand how we can connect you with programs that may be addressing concerns or modify programs to be more helpful. So with that, thank you to everyone that's been participating, and hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Annalisa and Leslie and Catherine.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everybody, bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.